I never thought I'd be the type to miss the obvious signs. I used to think I had a pretty good radar for these things, but when it actually happened to me, I got played like a fool. We'd been together for about 3 years, and everything seemed perfect, like the kind of relationship where people say, you two are so cute together, and you start believing it yourself. She was sweet, affectionate, and always said she couldn't wait for us to move in together. But then little things started to change, and I ignored every single one. It started with her phone. She used to leave it all over the place, on the couch, in the car, wherever. Then, all of a sudden, she wouldn't even leave it face up when we were together. I noticed she'd swipe away notifications the second they came in, like she was hiding something. I joked about it once, saying, "What? You got a secret admirer?" She laughed it off, but there was this edge to her smile, like she was testing me to see if I'd push further. I didn't. I figured everyone's entitled to some privacy, right? I didn't want to be that controlling boyfriend. But the secrecy got worse. She'd step outside to take calls, saying she didn't want to disturb me. It was strange because I never minded her talking on the phone around me before. And she started going out a lot more, meeting up with friends she'd never mentioned before, or spending long weekends catching up with her family. She'd come back with stories about how they went bowling or watched a movie, but the stories always felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced them on the drive home. When I asked if I could tag along sometime, she'd say things like, "Oh, it's just a girls' night. You wouldn't enjoy it." And like a chump, I believed her. Then there was the night that changed everything. We were at a friend's wedding, and she spent the whole night texting. It was weird because she normally loved being the life of the party. She kept sneaking off to the bathroom, and at one point, she disappeared for almost half an hour. I went looking for her and found her in the parking lot, sitting in the car with her phone pressed to her ear, talking in this low voice. When she saw me, she hung up immediately and plastered on this fake smile. "Just dealing with a friend crisis," she said, but the way her eyes darted around, she might as well have had a neon sign over her head saying, "I'm lying." I finally couldn't take it anymore. I brought it up when we got home that night, asked her who she was talking to, and she snapped at me. I'd never seen her so angry. She accused me of being paranoid, said I was trying to control her life. It turned into this huge blowout, and she ended up leaving to clear her head. That night, I sat alone in our apartment, staring at the empty spot on the couch where she usually curled up next to me. I knew something was seriously wrong, but I didn't want to believe it. A few days later, she seemed like she was trying to make up for the fight. She was suddenly all smiles, cooking me dinner, even suggesting we plan a weekend getaway. I thought maybe we'd turned a corner, but something still didn't feel right. It was like she was overcompensating. I remember thinking, she's acting like someone who got caught doing something bad, but is trying to make up for it before I realized what happened. And then the final piece fell into place. One evening, she left her laptop open on the kitchen table while she was in the shower. A notification popped up from a messaging app I'd never seen her use before. Curiosity got the best of me, and I clicked on it. There were dozens of messages between her and some guy. Flirty texts, jokes, even plans for a weekend away. The worst part was seeing her type the same pet name she used for me. It was like watching our relationship play out in some twisted parallel universe. I felt my whole world crumble in that moment. When she came out of the shower, she knew instantly that I had seen the messages. She tried to come up with some excuse, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time, she just looked defeated. I asked her why, and she started crying, saying it was a mistake, that she hadn't meant for it to go so far. But as she talked, all I could think about was how many times she had lied to my face, how many nights she had come home to me while secretly seeing him. It was like someone had ripped the blinders off my eyes, and I couldn't unsee it anymore. She asked if we could work through it, said she was willing to do whatever it took to fix things. But I was done. I couldn't look at her without picturing those messages, picturing her with him. I told her to pack her things and leave, and as she did, she kept saying, "I didn't want to hurt you. I just got lost." But I was numb by then. I felt like I was watching it all from a distance, like it wasn't even my life anymore. It's been almost 2 years now, and I still have moments where I wonder if I could have done something differently, if I'd confronted her sooner, if I hadn't ignored all those little signs. But honestly, I think she was just waiting for an excuse to move on. She wanted the thrill of something new, and I was just a stable option the safety net. That realization stings more than anything. Now, I'm trying to trust people again, but it's tough. I'm always looking for the hidden meaning behind every word, every little change in behavior. It's exhausting, but I can't help it. I used to think I was a good judge of character, but now I'm not so sure. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that if you feel like something's off, it probably is. Trust your gut, even if you don't like what it's telling you. Because sometimes the truth is the only thing that can set you free, even if it breaks you first. A few years back, I was taking an overnight train home from visiting a friend in another state. It was one of those long, sprawling routes that cut through the country, stopping at tiny stations in the middle of nowhere. I had a seat in a nearly empty car, with only a few other passengers scattered throughout, dozing under the dim lights. I wasn't too worried. I've always liked the solitude of train rides, watching the landscape pass by in the dark. Around 2 a.m., the train pulled into a small, desolate station. The platform was barely lit, a couple of flickering lamps casting weak halos of light onto cracked concrete. The train stopped for longer than usual, long enough that I got restless and decided to stretch my legs. I figured I'd step out onto the platform for some fresh air. I stepped off the train, my boots crunching on the gravel as I looked around. There was nothing but dense woods stretching out in every direction, a sea of black under a moonless sky. As I walked down the length of the train, I noticed someone standing further down the platform, just outside the glow of the lamps. He was facing away from me, his back hunched like he was reading something in his hands. I remember thinking it was odd. Why would anyone get off here? There were no other lights in sight, no signs of civilization beyond the station. The only sound was the hum of the train engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I ignored him, turning my back to the woods and taking a deep breath of the cool night air. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound, like footsteps, crunching slowly on the gravel behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but the platform was empty. The man I'd seen earlier had disappeared into the shadows. I shook it off, figuring he'd gone inside the train while I wasn't looking. But when I turned to head back to my car, the train doors slid shut with a loud clang. I rushed over, knocking on the door, but it wouldn't open. Panic prickled at the back of my mind. My backpack with my wallet, phone, everything was still inside. I pounded on the glass, but the conductor's booth seemed too far away for anyone to hear me. That's when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping behind one of the support beams further down the platform. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. "Hey, hello!" I called out, but my voice sounded small against the silence. There was no answer, just the soft shuffle of footsteps on gravel again, and a quiet, almost playful chuckle that echoed off the walls of the empty station. Every instinct in me screamed to get out of there. I ran down the platform, searching for an open door. My mind was racing, imagining everything from pranksters to something much worse. As I neared the end of the train, I saw another figure standing on the edge of the platform, barely visible in the weak light. This one was closer, facing me directly, their head tilted slightly to the side like they were watching me. I skidded to a stop, my breath catching in my throat. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, but they didn't respond. They just stood there, perfectly still, hands hanging at their sides. I couldn't see their face clearly, just the outline of their body against the shadows of the trees. My hands were shaking as I reached for the emergency button on the train door. I kept glancing between the figure and the train, praying for the door to open. It finally slid open with a hiss, and I scrambled inside, slamming it behind me. As I turned to look back, the figure was gone. The platform was empty, the woods beyond it silent, but I could feel a pair of eyes on me, like a weight pressing into my back. I ran down the aisle to my seat, not even caring how I must have looked to the other passengers. I sat down, my heart pounding, and forced myself to breathe. Maybe it was my imagination, I thought. Maybe the lack of sleep had gotten to me, or the dark just played tricks on my eyes. But just as the train started to pull away, I glanced out the window and froze. The first figure, the one I'd seen reading something, was back, standing at the far end of the platform. Only this time, he wasn't alone. 4 or 5 other shadows stood with him, all facing the train as it rolled away. They were so still, like statues, watching us disappear into the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the trip. I just stared out the window, half expecting to see those figures running alongside the train or waiting at the next station. When I finally reached my stop in the morning, the sun creeping over the horizon, I practically ran off the train, desperate to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me, and I looked up the station online. Turns out it had been decommissioned for years, barely used except for emergency stops or maintenance. Nobody was supposed to get on or off there, but the train sometimes made unscheduled stops if the conductor needed a break. The thought made my skin crawl. I still can't explain what I saw that night, or why those figures were out there in the middle of nowhere. But I know one thing for sure: I'll never step off a train in the dark again. Sometimes, the unknown is best left behind you, blurred by distance and speed. This happened when I was 21 and living in my hometown after dropping out of college. I was in that post-dropout limbo, working as a delivery driver for a local pizza place. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and it let me drive around listening to music, so I didn't mind it too much. Most of my deliveries were to the same regulars: families, retirees, the occasional group of rowdy teenagers. But there was one address that stood out to me. It belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Douglas, the parents of a high school friend I'd drifted apart from. Their house was this nice place on a quiet street with a big oak tree out front. Mrs. Douglas, call me Helen, she always insisted, was the one who usually answered the door. She'd always give me a big smile, ask how I'd been, and tip generously. Mr. Douglas wasn't around much, always traveling for work, she'd say with a wave of her hand. There was something kind of lonely about her, but I never thought much of it. One night, I made a late delivery to their place around 10 p.m. Helen answered the door, but this time she wasn't her usual chipper self. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. She paid for the pizza, and then, as I turned to leave, she blurted out, "Wait, do you have time to come in for a bit?" It caught me off guard, but she looked so sad, so I said sure. She poured us both glasses of wine, and we sat at the dining table. She told me how she and Mr. Douglas were going through a rough patch, how he was gone more than he was home, and how she felt like she didn't know what to do with herself anymore. I mostly just listened, not sure what to say. It's not like I was some great sage of relationship advice. After a while, she seemed to cheer up a bit, and we ended up laughing over old stories about her son and the dumb stuff we used to do back in high school. The conversation got lighter, and after a couple more glasses, it was starting to feel less like a pity party and more like, well, I don't know. But when she put her hand on my arm and gave me this look, I suddenly realized we were in territory I never thought I'd find myself in. She leaned in and kissed me, and I kissed her back. It was like all the tension and loneliness she'd been carrying melted away in that moment. I should have stopped it right there. I knew it was wrong. I mean, she was the mother of an old friend, and I could only imagine how bad things could get if her husband found out. But instead, I let myself get swept up in it, convincing myself it was just a one-time thing, a moment of comfort. The next morning, I woke up on their couch, fully clothed, but with a serious headache and a gnawing sense of guilt. Helen came downstairs and handed me a cup of coffee like this was normal, like we hadn't crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I mumbled something about needing to get to work, and she just smiled and said, "You know, it was nice having someone to talk to." I kept expecting it to be awkward after that, but it wasn't. In fact, she started texting me, asking me to come over for coffee or dinner, always when her husband was out of town. It turned into this strange routine, me delivering more than just pizzas, if you know what I mean. Sometimes we'd just talk, but other times, things would escalate and I'd end up staying the night. It was a messed up situation, but for a while it felt like I was filling some kind of void for her, and maybe for myself too. Then one night, she asked me to meet her at a bar across town. It was a weeknight, so the place was mostly empty, and she seemed more nervous than usual. She told me she and her husband had gotten into a huge fight, and that he'd accused her of cheating. He didn't know about me specifically, but he could tell she was distant, that she wasn't the same anymore. I could see how stressed she was, and I started to realize how deep I'd gotten into something I couldn't fix. "I think we need to stop," she said, her voice barely a whisper. For both our sakes. I nodded, trying to hide the relief that I felt mixed with a strange sense of loss. As complicated as it was, I'd gotten used to being a part of her life, even if it was in secret. I told her that she was right, that it was for the best, and she just smiled sadly, like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was convincing me. We stopped seeing each other after that. I went back to delivering pizzas, trying to move on, but it wasn't that simple. A few months later, I heard through the grapevine that Helen and Mr. Douglas had separated. I didn't know if it was because of us or just the natural end of something that had been breaking for a long time. Either way, I felt like I'd played a part in their unraveling, and that's not an easy thing to live with. A while later, Helen moved away. I never reached out to her, and she never tried to contact me either. But every now and then when I drive by their old house, I remember those nights, the secrets we kept, and the way it all fell apart. I know I should feel more regret, and part of me does, but another part just feels empty. Like I let myself get caught in something that was never really mine to begin with. I still think about her sometimes, not in a longing way, but more like a chapter in my life that never really had a proper ending. I don't know if she's happier now, or if she ever thinks back on those nights like I do. All I know is that it's a mess I hope I never find myself in again. If there's any advice I can give, it's this. Don't let yourself be the solution to someone else's loneliness. It's a trap that's harder to escape than you think. I used to think that death from above was just a dramatic phrase like something you'd hear in a war movie. But then one random Tuesday morning, a piece of everyday life nearly killed me. And I still think about it every time I'm driving on the highway. It was one of those gray, drizzly days, the kind where the clouds hang low and everything looks washed out. I was on my way to work, stuck in the usual morning traffic, the radio playing softly while I zoned out, thinking about nothing in particular. The highway was packed and everyone was doing that stop-and-go shuffle, inching forward, brake lights flashing like some synchronized dance. I wasn't paying much attention, just another commuter in the sea of cars, until I noticed the semi-truck in the next lane. It was hauling what looked like a bunch of building materials, pipes, wooden planks, that kind of stuff, secured with a bunch of straps and tarps. I remember thinking vaguely that it looked a little loose, but hey, that's not my problem, right? The traffic cleared up a little, and the truck sped up, leaving me behind. I didn't think about it again until maybe 10 minutes later, when I saw the same truck up ahead, weaving slightly, like the driver was trying to keep control. And then, out of nowhere, one of those long metal pipes slid off the back of the truck, bouncing onto the road with a loud, metallic clank. It skidded across the asphalt, spinning and rolling, a blur of silver that seemed to stretch out in slow motion. I don't think I even had time to react. My body moved before my brain did. I swerved hard to the right, narrowly missing the pipe as it slid past me. But the car in the lane beside me wasn't so lucky. The driver must not have seen it in time because their front tire hit the pipe dead on. The sound was like a gunshot, an explosion of rubber and metal. The car veered sharply, slamming into the guardrail with a horrible crunch, sparks flying as metal scraped against concrete. It was like watching a disaster unfold in real time, except I was right in the middle of it. I hit my brakes, my car fishtailing as I tried to regain control, barely missing the wreckage in front of me. For a second, I thought I was going to spin out and crash into the median, but somehow I managed to straighten out, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst right through my chest. I pulled over onto the shoulder, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't even grip the steering wheel properly. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the wrecked car, crumpled against the guardrail, steam rising from the hood. People were already stopping to help, dialing 911, but I just sat there frozen, the scene playing over and over in my head. I couldn't believe how close I'd come to being caught up in that chaos, how a split second's difference could have meant that pipe hitting my windshield instead. When the police finally arrived and took statements, I couldn't even find the words to describe what had happened. I just kept thinking about that pipe, how casually it had rolled off the truck, like it had no idea it was carrying enough force to end a life. The driver of the car that hit it was still inside, and the paramedics were working to pull him out. I caught a glimpse of his face. He was conscious, but his eyes were wide with shock, staring at the wreckage of his car like he couldn't believe it was real. I heard later that he made it out with just a broken arm and a concussion, but it easily could have been much worse. I'll never forget the way that pipe looked as it bounced along the highway, as if the universe had tossed out a reminder of how fragile everything is. It's terrifying how little control we actually have, how we trust our lives to things like straps and tie-downs, assuming they'll hold when it matters. But sometimes they don't, and you find yourself facing a split-second decision that changes everything. I couldn't drive past a truck for weeks after that. My hands would go clammy, my breath coming in short, panic bursts, and I'd instinctively slow down, putting as much distance between me and any loose-looking cargo as possible. My friends teased me about being paranoid, but they didn't get it. They hadn't seen how fast it could happen. One moment, you're sipping your coffee, humming along to a song on the radio, and the next, you're staring death in the face, swerving for your life. The whole experience left me with this weird sense of hyper-awareness on the road, like I could never completely relax. I'd watch every car, every truck, studying their movements, looking for anything that might signal danger. It's exhausting, honestly, but I'd rather feel paranoid than risk being caught off guard again. I even started carrying one of those emergency window breakers in my glove box, like it could somehow ward off disaster, like it could give me some small sense of control. And the nightmares, yeah, those came too. I dream about the pipe, except in my dreams, I wasn't fast enough. It would come crashing through the windshield, glass shattering, metal slicing through the air, and I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing as if I'd just swerved all over again. Even now, years later, the memory still haunts me. The nightmares don't come as often, but I still have this nagging feeling every time I'm on the highway, like I'm waiting for the next random object to fly into my path. I know it sounds dramatic, but when you've seen how quickly things can change, it stays with you. It's not just about driving safely or keeping your distance. It's about realizing that there's always something you can't control. And that's the scariest part. Because the truth is, we're all out there, hurtling down the highway in these metal boxes, trusting that nothing will go wrong. But sometimes it does, and you realize how close you came to being just another headline in the local news, another tragic story that people read and then forget. I guess that's why I'm always the one reminding my friends to keep their distance when we're driving. Don't get too close to that truck, you never know what might fall off, I'll say, and they'll roll their eyes and call me overcautious. But I'd rather be that person, the one who's too careful, than be caught off guard again. It only takes a second, after all, just one loose pipe, one missed strap, and suddenly your whole world changes. Now, every time I pass by a truck on the highway, I remember that day, and I remind myself to breathe. It's just a little piece of steel, I think just one more thing to watch out for. But in the back of my mind, I know that I'm not really in control. That any moment, something as simple as a loose pipe could come rolling my way. And that's enough to keep me alert, no matter how many miles stretch out in front of me. For almost a decade now, I've been living with this secret, and the weight of it has become so familiar that I don't even know what it feels like to be without it anymore. I never meant for things to get this far, but sometimes life has a way of pushing you in directions you never thought you'd go. It started with something innocent, something I thought was no big deal, but it's grown into this tangled mess that I can't escape. I used to work at a fairly big company, one of those places where everyone is always rushing around and barely anyone knows each other's name. I was just another faceless employee in a sea of cubicles, typing away at spreadsheets and trying to climb the ladder like everyone else. But about a year in, I realized that my boss never really checked the details of our expense reports. He'd glance over them, maybe ask a question or two, but as long as the numbers seemed reasonable, he signed off on everything. At first, it was just a few dollars here and there. I'd add a little extra to my travel expenses, just enough to cover lunch or coffee during those long meetings. It felt like no big deal. After all, the company had plenty of money and I was barely scraping by. I figured it was harmless, like taking a couple of extra office supplies home. But those small changes started adding up, and after a few months, I realized I was getting away with it. Then my car broke down. The repairs were way more than I could afford, and I didn't have enough in savings to cover it. I remember sitting in the mechanic's shop, staring at the estimate, feeling this cold sweat creeping down my back. And that's when it hit me. What if I just added a few $100s to my next expense report? It wasn't like anyone would notice, right? I could pay for the repairs and then get back to playing by the rules. So I did it. And when the reimbursement came through without a hitch, I felt this strange mix of relief and guilt. But the relief was stronger, and I told myself it was just a one-time thing. Except it wasn't. A few months later, I had a medical bill that I couldn't quite cover, and then my rent went up unexpectedly. And before I knew it, I was padding my expense reports every few weeks, convincing myself that I'd pay it all back someday when I got a better job or a raise. But life doesn't always go as planned. Instead of getting a promotion, my department got downsized, and I was laid off along with a dozen others. I remember sitting in that sterile conference room, clutching my little severance check, and feeling like the ground had just disappeared beneath my feet. I had no idea what I was going to do, especially with the extra money I'd borrowed from the company. It wasn't like I could just walk back in there and pay it back without raising questions. After that, I bounced around between a few temp jobs, just trying to make ends meet, but it was never enough. And the guilt? It ate at me every single day. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced that someone would show up at my door and confront me about what I'd done. But as the months went by, no one ever did. It was like I'd gotten away with it, but instead of feeling relieved, I just felt trapped by my own mistakes. A year after losing that job, I finally managed to get back on my feet with a new position at a different company. It was a fresh start, but I couldn't let go of what I'd done. Every time someone mentioned anything about expenses or audits, my stomach would twist into knots. I'd smile and nod, but inside, I was panicking, wondering if they could somehow see right through me. I became obsessive about keeping my finances in check, trying to make sure I'd never be in a position where I'd even think about doing something like that again. But the fear never really left, and as much as I wanted to tell someone to get it off my chest and maybe find some way to make amends, I couldn't bring myself to do it. How do you admit that you did something so stupid and selfish, something that still haunts you even after all these years? So I kept my mouth shut, telling myself that as long as no one found out, it didn't really matter. Then about 6 months ago, I got an email from an old coworker. He said he'd heard some rumors that the company I used to work for was conducting an internal audit, going through old records. He thought it was funny, just a little gossip to share, but I felt like my heart stopped in my chest. I spent the next few weeks in a state of absolute panic, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to call me out of the blue and tell me they'd found the discrepancies in those old reports. But nothing happened. Weeks passed, and then months, and it became clear that they hadn't found anything. I dodged the bullet, at least for now, but the whole ordeal brought everything rushing back, all the guilt and shame that I'd been trying so hard to bury. And the worst part is, I still haven't told anyone. I'm still living with this secret that I can't seem to shake, this constant fear that someday it's all going to come back and blow up in my face. Some days, I think about going back to that company and just confessing, paying back every cent I took, even if it means ruining my own reputation. But I can't bring myself to do it. I'm too scared of what might happen, too scared of facing the consequences. So, I keep living with this knot in my chest, pretending that everything is fine while knowing that there's this shadow hanging over me. I don't know if I'll ever find the courage to come clean, or if I'll spend the rest of my life waiting for the past to catch up with me. But for now, I just keep moving forward, hoping that maybe, somehow, I can leave it all behind without having to face the truth. Maybe it makes me a coward, but it's the only way I know how to keep going. And who knows, maybe someday, I'll find a way to forgive myself, even if no one else ever knows what I did. It's weird how looking back, every little sign stands out like a flashing red light, but at the time, I just couldn't see it. We had been together for 5 years solid, or so I thought. He was always affectionate, always making plans for the future, even talking about moving in together, getting a dog, all that stuff. But then things shifted. Subtle, at first. He started spending a lot more time at work, which wasn't unusual given his job. But the excuses started to pile up. Working late again, babe. Don't wait up. Or, sorry, I have a last-minute project this weekend. It was never anything I could outright question, but I started to feel like I was playing second fiddle to something. It wasn't until one weekend when we had planned a little getaway that I started to truly feel that pit in my stomach. He backed out at the last minute, claiming that his boss needed him to handle a big client meeting. He even gave me this whole spiel about how he was doing it for our future. I believed him, and I went by myself. But when I got back, I found a receipt for 2 dinners in his jacket pocket. The kind of fancy restaurant we usually went to for special occasions. He said it was a work dinner, but I noticed his voice got all high-pitched, like he was trying to rush through the explanation. Then there was the sudden change in his phone behavior. He used to leave it lying around, no worries, no password. But suddenly, he was super protective of it. He'd take calls outside, saying it was a bad connection inside the house. Or he'd step into another room if I walked by while he was texting. When I asked him about it, he got defensive, saying, "Can't a guy have some privacy?" It was like I had accused him of something, even though I hadn't. I remember thinking, what do you have to hide? But it wasn't just a phone. He started getting really critical of me, like everything I did annoyed him. I'd try to joke around like we used to, but he'd snap at me or roll his eyes. He'd get irritated if I asked simple questions like how his day went or if he wanted to grab dinner. Suddenly, it felt like he couldn't stand to be around me, and I had no idea what I'd done to cause it. It's crazy how quickly you start to blame yourself when someone treats you like that. One night, he came home late, smelling like a mix of expensive cologne that wasn't his, and maybe guilt. He jumped straight into the shower, which wasn't his usual routine. My suspicions flared up, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I went through his car the next morning, and there, stuffed between the seat cushions, was a crumpled up movie ticket for 2. I don't even remember feeling hurt at that moment. I just felt cold, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. I didn't confront him right away. I tried to gather myself, figure out what to do next. I was hoping maybe there was some logical explanation that I hadn't thought of yet. But then, 2 days later, I got a message on social media. It was from a woman I'd never met, but she seemed to know a lot about me, more specifically about him. She sent screenshots of their texts, pictures of them together. They had been seeing each other for at least 4 months. All those nights he was working late. My hands were shaking as I read through her message. She said she found out about me from a mutual friend of theirs and thought I deserved to know. That night, when he came home, I was waiting on the couch with my phone in hand. He tried to kiss me on the cheek, like it was just another Tuesday, but I pulled away. I showed him the messages, and his face turned gray. He stuttered something about how she was just a friend, that it wasn't what it looked like, that he could explain. But the truth was all right there in the pictures she sent. Dinner dates, weekend trips, even a picture of them together in front of the same restaurant he had taken me to for my last birthday. I didn't even yell. I just asked him to leave. I think that's what threw him off the most, that I didn't give him a chance to manipulate the story or twist my feelings around. I was done, completely and utterly done. He packed a bag that night and left, but not before saying, "I thought you'd be more understanding about this." Can you believe that? As if it was my job to be okay with being lied to, with being treated like a backup plan. It's been a year since then, and I've done a lot of reflecting. I replay every little sign in my head, wondering how I missed them, how I let myself be so blindsided. But I think that's the thing about love. You want to trust so badly that you ignore your own intuition. You convince yourself that your doubts are just insecurities, that your partner would never hurt you like that. But sometimes they do, and it's like having the ground pulled out from under you. Now, when I think about dating again, I can't help but feel this knot of anxiety in my chest. I find myself analyzing every word, every little gesture, wondering if it's just history repeating itself. But I'm trying to move forward. Therapy helps. So does spending time with friends who remind me that I'm not crazy, that I'm worth more than being someone's second choice. The worst part is sometimes I still miss him. Not the guy who cheated, but the guy I thought he was. The guy who used to make me laugh until my sides hurt, who used to plan surprise dates and tell me he couldn't imagine life without me. I realize now that person never really existed. He was just a role he played until he didn't feel like playing it anymore. But you know what? I'm learning to be okay with that. I'm learning to trust myself again, to believe that next time, if there are signs, I'll see them for what they are. If anyone reading this has that same pit in their stomach, that same sense that something just isn't right, listen to it. You're not imagining things. And it's better to face the truth, no matter how much it hurts, than to keep living in a lie. Trust me on that. I haven't told a single soul that I'm terrified of mirrors. Yep, you heard me right. Full-grown adult, and I can't stand looking into mirrors at night. During the day, it's fine, like I shave, I brush my teeth, I check for spinach in my teeth before a meeting. But after the sun sets? No way. I make a point of avoiding mirrors like they're cursed. And honestly, I think my friends would think I'd lost my mind if they knew. It started back when I was a kid, maybe 10 or 11. My older brother thought it would be hilarious to scare me with some urban legend he picked up from the kids at school. He told me about this thing called the Mirror Man. According to him, if you looked into a mirror at night, you might see the Mirror Man standing behind you, staring at you. And if you locked eyes with him, you'd be stuck in the mirror forever. I remember him whispering that story to me right before bed, and then turning off the lights. I was frozen in my bed, staring at the closet mirror, just waiting for a shadow to move. Now, logically, I know it's all nonsense. I've Googled it, checked Reddit, even read a few books on childhood fears and why they stick with you. But none of that helps when it's 2 a.m. I'm stumbling to the bathroom, and I catch a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. My heart races like I've just sprinted a mile, and I keep my eyes glued to the floor, pretending like I don't see anything. It's not even that I actually think some creepy figure is going to appear behind me. It's just this gut reaction, this deep-seated anxiety that makes my skin crawl. So, I've developed all these weird little habits to avoid dealing with it. I rearranged my apartment so that my bed doesn't face the mirror. I hung a tapestry over the full-length mirror in my bedroom so that I don't accidentally glance at it when I'm changing. I've even gotten pretty good at turning off the bathroom light with my eyes closed, just so I don't catch my own reflection in the dark. My friends probably think I'm obsessed with interior decorating with all the strategically placed plants and wall hangings, but it's all just part of the cover-up. The closest I ever came to confessing was during a game of Never Have I Ever at a party. Someone said, "Never have I ever been afraid of the dark," and I almost let it slip that it's not the dark I'm afraid of, it's the damn mirrors. But instead, I laughed it off, downed my drink, and kept my mouth shut. I could already imagine the reactions. The jokes, the teasing, the way my buddy Steve would probably buy me a tiny hand mirror as a gag gift for my next birthday. No thanks. The weirdest part is that I actually work in real estate, which means I'm constantly in other people's houses with their floor-to-ceiling mirrors, mirrored closets, and those bizarre designer bathrooms with reflective surfaces everywhere. It's like a minefield. When I show clients around, I always make sure to angle my body, so I'm not looking directly into any mirrors, which makes me look like I'm really into whatever wallpaper they've got going on. And I've become a master at turning on bathroom lights from just outside the doorway. They probably think I'm super considerate, giving them the first look at everything, but really, I'm just avoiding my own reflection like it's a ghost. Once, during a house showing, I got caught off guard. It was this older place with a huge, antique mirror in the hallway. One of those ornate, creepy ones that you'd expect to see in a haunted mansion. I wasn't paying attention and turned right into it. For a split second, I swear I saw something move behind me. It was probably just a trick of the light or the reflection of the curtains swaying in the breeze, but I felt my stomach drop. I nearly bolted out of the house right then and there, but I managed to pull myself together before my clients noticed anything weird. After they left, I had to take a few deep breaths outside in my car just to calm down. I still don't know why it bothers me so much. It's been over 20 years since my brother told me that stupid story, and he doesn't even remember it anymore. But every time I think about telling someone, I imagine the look on their face. I picture my girlfriend raising an eyebrow, saying something like, "So you're afraid of yourself?" Or my mom laughing and reminding me that there's nothing in the mirror that isn't already in the room. But that's the problem, isn't it? It's not the mirror itself. It's what might be hiding in the corners. What might be lurking just beyond the glass when I'm not paying attention. I'll try to face it, you know? There was this one time I stayed up late, pacing around my living room, psyching myself up to do some exposure therapy, and just stand in front of a mirror in the dark for a few minutes. I even poured myself a whiskey, thinking maybe a little liquid courage would help. But the second I turned off the lights and saw the vague outline of my reflection, I chickened out. I flipped the lights back on and practically ran out of the room, like some kind of ridiculous horror movie scene. The whole thing was so stupid that I actually laughed about it. But the laugh felt more like a nervous hiccup. So, yeah, that's my secret. I'm the guy who can close a business deal with a handshake, but I'm too scared to look at a mirror after sunset. I keep telling myself I'll get over it someday, that maybe I'll find some therapist who will help me dig deep and figure out why this stuck with me for so long. But for now, I just keep my head down, avoid the mirrors, and keep pretending like I've got it all together. The only person who might suspect something is my girlfriend, because she's caught me covering the bedroom mirror at night a few times. I always brush it off, say something like, "Oh, it just helps me sleep better," or I read somewhere that it's good for your energy, and she just shrugs and goes along with it. She probably thinks I'm a little quirky, but I'll take quirky over completely irrational any day. And who knows, maybe someday I'll tell her the truth about the mirror man, about my weird nighttime routines. Or maybe I'll just keep it buried and let this secret fade into the shadows like everything else. There was this one night during senior year that became legendary, like something you'd think only happens in movies. It was homecoming, the biggest game of the year, and our school's football team was actually doing well for once. Usually, our team, the Golden Bears, was more like the Barely Golden. But that year, we had a shot at winning against our rivals, the Ridgewood Raiders, and the whole town showed up to watch. The bleachers were packed, the cheerleaders had practiced extra routines, and the air smelled like cheap nachos and excitement. But none of that is why the night went down in history. The real story started when someone, no one knows who for sure, decided to steal the school mascot costume right before the game. We had this huge bear mascot, Benny, that usually danced around on the sidelines. It was this old, beat-up costume with a head that always seemed slightly off-kilter, and the poor kid inside could barely see through the mesh eye holes. But Benny was a tradition, and during homecoming, he was a big deal. So, when Benny went missing, people freaked out. I was hanging out with my friends near the snack stand, trying to flirt with the girl working the hot chocolate machine, when we heard the news. Some underclassmen came running over, out of breath, yelling, "Benny's gone. Someone stole Benny." At first, I didn't think much of it, just another dumb prank. But as the night went on, the whole school started buzzing with rumors. Some people said the Raiders stole it as sabotage. Others thought it was just a joke gone wrong. Then, halfway through the third quarter, when the game was neck and neck, Benny made his reappearance. And that's when things got wild. Out of nowhere, this guy in the Benny costume comes sprinting across the field, right in the middle of a play. The crowd went nuts, but not in the fun way. More like the "what the hell is going on" kind of way. He was stumbling all over the place, barely keeping the giant bear head upright, and nearly collided with one of our players. The refs blew their whistles like mad, but Benny didn't stop. He just kept running, zigzagging between the players like he was trying to dodge invisible defenders. It didn't take long before everyone realized that the person inside the costume wasn't the usual kid who played Benny. For one thing, he was moving way too fast. And for another, he started chugging from a bottle of what was clearly not Gatorade. I heard someone in the crowd yell, "Is Benny drunk?" And then, like a signal, laughter broke out across the stands. Even the Raiders fans on the other side of the field were pointing and laughing. But Benny wasn't done. He reached the end zone, ripped off the bear head, and held it up like it was a trophy. And that's when we all realized who it was. Jimmy Reyes, one of the seniors who had a bit of a reputation for pulling off dumb stunts. Jimmy was the kind of guy who'd jump off the roof into a kiddie pool if you dared him. And he'd had a few run-ins with the school cops before. But this time, he'd outdone himself. Jimmy started yelling some slurred speech about freedom for Benny and how the mascot was tired of being locked away in the storage closet. He rambled on about school spirit and liberating the bear, but it was hard to take him seriously when he was stumbling around in oversized bare feet. He was waving the bear head around like a victory flag, and the whole thing turned into a scene straight out of a bad comedy movie. The best part? Our football team just kept playing around him. At first, they hesitated, looking back at the refs for guidance, but then they just decided to keep going, ignoring the spectacle in the end zone. The Raiders players were laughing so hard some of them couldn't keep their helmets on straight. It became this bizarre background to the actual game, with Jimmy, still in the bear costume from the neck down, swaying and sloshing his bottle, yelling things like "You can't cage the bear," while the game went on around him. The principal, Mr. Anders, stormed out onto the field, looking red-faced and furious. He tried to grab Jimmy by the arm, but Jimmy, in true chaotic spirit, slipped out of the bear's suit entirely and darted down the sideline in nothing but his boxers. That's when things really went off the rails. Jimmy managed to outrun Mr. Anders and made a beeline for the bleachers, where a bunch of students were egging him on, shouting, "Run, Jimmy, run." He got halfway up the stands before a couple of cops finally caught up with him. They dragged him back down the bleachers, and I swear he was still shouting about Benny's freedom the whole time. The crowd erupted into a mix of boos and cheers. And honestly, most of us couldn't decide if we were horrified or just having the time of our lives. Meanwhile, the game wrapped up, with our team managing to scrape out a win against the Raiders. But by that point, nobody cared about the score. All anyone could talk about was Jimmy's ridiculous stunt. Even the Raiders fans were taking photos and high-fiving each other like they'd just watched some historic play. Social media blew up with clips of Jimmy sprinting across the field in the Bears suit, and the hashtag #FreeBenny started trending locally. It became this whole meme, with students photoshopping pictures of Benny in weird places. Benny on the moon, Benny riding a dinosaur, you name it. Of course, Jimmy got into huge trouble. He was suspended immediately, and his parents had to pay for the damage he'd done to the costume. There were rumors that the school was going to press charges for trespassing or public drunkenness or something, but in the end, they just wanted it all to go away as quickly as possible. They tried to sweep it under the rug, but the story spread like wildfire. Even years later, at every reunion, people still talk about the night Benny came to life and went rogue. For a while, the school banned the use of the Benny costume, saying it was under review for repairs. But when they finally brought it back for the next year's football season, the new kid inside the costume was under strict orders not to deviate from a script approved by the administration. Everyone said it wasn't the same anymore. Benny had lost his wild spirit. No thanks to Jimmy and his midnight liberation attempt. But for those of us who were there that night, it's impossible to forget. It's the kind of story you tell your friends whenever you try to explain just how weird high school could get. And every time I see some old mascot at a game, I think back to Jimmy, standing in that end zone with a bare head held high, slurring his speech about freedom and school spirit. It was stupid, reckless, and completely out of control. But it's the kind of memory that sticks with you, the kind that makes you miss the chaos of those days, even if you'd never admit it to your own kids. You'd think that something as simple as a backyard swimming pool couldn't turn deadly in seconds, but I found out the hard way that water isn't something to mess with. We had just moved into a new house, and it came with this beautiful in-ground pool, complete with a diving board and that little waterfall feature you see in brochures. It was my parents' dream home. They threw pool parties every weekend, neighbors and friends over, barbecue smoking, kids splashing around. We had those big inflatable floats and one of those beach ball nets set up in the shallow end. It was perfect until the day it wasn't. It happened during one of those lazy summer afternoons, the kind where the sun is so hot that even the water feels warm. My little brother, Sammy, was about 8 at the time, and he couldn't get enough of the pool. He'd spend hours diving off the board, pretending to be a superhero crashing into the water. My mom would watch him from the kitchen window while she cleaned up, and I was supposed to be outside keeping an eye on him. Though most days I just scroll on my phone, barely paying attention to the splash sounds in the background. This particular afternoon, I remember getting into some pointless argument with a friend over text. My focus was completely on my screen, the pool barely registering as more than background noise. Sammy had been practicing his cannonballs over and over, laughing as he tried to make bigger splashes. At some point, the splashing stopped, but I didn't look up right away. I figured he was just catching his breath or grabbing a snack from the cooler. When the silence stretched a bit too long, a tiny voice in the back of my head whispered that something wasn't right. I glanced up, expecting to see him floating on one of the inflatable tubes, but the pool surface was completely still. My heart did this weird flutter in my chest, and I called out, "Sammy?" No answer. I stood up, my stomach twisting with this sudden sense of dread, scanning the water, and that's when I saw it, a small ripple near the deep end. I rushed over, my legs feeling like they were moving through molasses, and that's when I spotted him at the bottom of the pool, tangled up in the long tail of the inflatable dragon float. His arms were flailing, bubbles streaming up to the surface. He wasn't moving like a swimmer. He was thrashing, panicked. I didn't even think. I just dove in, clothes and all, the water hitting me like a shock. Everything became muffled and surreal as I swam down toward him, my hands reaching out for his arm. He was kicking wildly, eyes wide with terror, and I could feel the drag of the float wrapped around his ankle, pulling him down. I grabbed the tail of the dragon and yanked, my lungs burning as I tried to untangle him, but the float was twisted tight. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to do it, that I'd have to let go, swim up for air, and try again. But then I saw the way Sammy's mouth opened, gasping out the last of his breath, and something in me snapped. I pulled with everything I had, my fingers slipping on the slick plastic, and finally, the knot came loose. I grabbed him under the arms and kicked upward, the world above shimmering like some unreachable dream. We broke through the surface, and I gasped in air, coughing and sputtering, dragging Sammy over to the edge. I pushed him up onto the pool deck, and he just lay there, not moving, his lips a pale, terrifying blue. My mind went blank with panic. I didn't know what to do. I'd seen CPR on TV, but suddenly my brain was empty, like all those scenes had just been wiped clean. I remember screaming for my mom, my voice cracking and desperate. She ran out in a blur, her face frozen in horror. She dropped beside Sammy, barely pausing before she started doing chest compressions, her hands pressing down rhythmically on his tiny chest. "Come on, baby, breathe." She kept whispering through tears, her voice breaking on every word. I hovered uselessly, soaking wet, shivering even though the sun was still blazing down on us. It felt like hours before Sammy sputtered and coughed up water, his chest heaving as he dragged in a shuddering breath. My mom collapsed beside him, sobbing with relief, and I just knelt there, my hands shaking so hard that I had to sit on them to make it stop. The sound of sirens came next, the blur of paramedics rushing in, checking Sammy over, and asking us questions that I could barely answer. All I could think about was how close I'd come to losing him. How if I hadn't looked up when I did, he might have been... I couldn't even finish the thought. The paramedics said he'd be fine, but that he needed to go to the hospital for observation. I rode with him in the back of the ambulance, gripping his hand like I was afraid he'd slip away again. He looked so small lying there, wrapped up in a foil blanket, still shivering. I kept trying to apologize, but he just squeezed my hand and said, "I'm okay, it's okay," even though I knew it wasn't. After that day, the pool wasn't the same for any of us. My parents installed a fence with a locked gate around it, but Sammy stopped wanting to swim, no matter how many times we promised to keep watch. And me? I couldn't look at that pool without feeling a wave of guilt so strong it made me sick. I'd sit outside sometimes, staring at the water, thinking about how quickly it had gone from a fun, sunny afternoon to a nightmare. It was just a few seconds. That's all it took for everything to flip upside down. I think about all the stories you hear, the ones where kids drown in a backyard pool while everyone's distracted. People always think it's about bad parents or reckless kids, but the truth is it happens so fast. One moment you're laughing, and the next you're pulling a child out of the water, praying that it isn't too late. Even now, years later, I can't go near a pool without feeling my chest tighten, like I'm right back in that moment, diving down towards Sammy, feeling time slipping through my fingers like the water itself. Now I'm that annoying person who always hovers by the pool, watching kids like a hawk, reminding parents about life jackets and safety gates. I'll never be the person who takes water lightly again, because water, no matter how beautiful, how calm, can turn deadly in the blink of an eye. It's heavy, powerful, and once it gets a grip on you, it doesn't let go. Sammy's fine now. He's a teenager, taller than me, and he likes to joke about how I saved his life that one time. But I can tell it still haunts him too. He doesn't like to talk about it much, and I don't blame him. Some memories are better left at the bottom of a pool, buried with the tangled tail of an inflatable dragon. But I'll never forget it. It's a scar that doesn't show on the outside, but it's there all the same, reminding me of how fragile everything really is. How water, which seems so innocent, can suddenly become a monster, pulling you under before you even know what's happening. It's a danger that's always lurking, just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when you least expect it. This one's a bit of a doozy, but here goes. I was 24, working as a server at a small Italian restaurant, trying to figure out what the hell to do with my life. You know, that stage where you feel like everyone's moving on to better things while you're stuck in neutral. Anyway, I'd known Michelle for a long time, She was my ex-girlfriend's mom. Back in high school, I dated her daughter, Sarah, for a couple of years. We broke up when I went to college, but I stayed friendly with Michelle. She was one of those super welcoming moms, the kind who insisted on feeding you whenever you came over, and she never really treated me like I was just Sarah's boyfriend. After the breakup, I hadn't seen them much. Sarah moved out of state, got married, the whole 9 yards. But Michelle stayed in town, and every once in a while, I'd bump into her at the grocery store or around the neighborhood. She'd always ask how I was doing, joke about how I needed to eat more, stuff like that. There was this warmth to her that I missed, a kind of familiarity that made me feel less adrift. Then, one night, I got a call from her. It was out of the blue. She told me she was having a small get-together, and thought I might want to drop by. I almost said no because it felt weird, but I didn't really have anything else going on, so I figured why not. When I got to her place, though, I realized it wasn't a party at all. It was just her, sitting at the dining room table with a bottle of wine and a few glasses set out. She apologized for the deception and said she just didn't want to be alone that night. She told me how Sarah rarely visited, how she felt like an afterthought in her daughter's life now. I felt bad for her, and we ended up talking for hours about Sarah, about her ex-husband, about how strange life was turning out to be. It was nice, and by the time I left, I felt closer to her than I had in years. A few days later, she texted me, inviting me over again. This time, I brought over takeout and we watched a movie. It became a routine, me coming over after work, sometimes with dinner, sometimes with nothing but a couple of six-packs. She'd ask about my day, we'd share stories, and it was honestly just nice to have someone to talk to. Then one night, things took a turn. We were on her couch, halfway through some old rom-com, when she reached out and put her hand on mine. I remember freezing up, feeling the weight of it, but I didn't pull away. She looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, like she was weighing her next words carefully. "I've missed having company like this," she said softly. "You make me feel young again." I tried to laugh it off, but she didn't let go of my hand. I think I mumbled something about how I liked hanging out with her too, but she just leaned in closer. And then she kissed me. It was slow, tentative, like she wasn't sure if I'd push her away. I didn't, even though every part of my brain was screaming that this was a bad idea. It felt strange and thrilling, like stepping off a ledge without knowing if there'd be water below. That night, I ended up staying over. We both knew it was crossing a line, but we ignored it, choosing to live in that moment instead of thinking about what it meant. I woke up in her bed the next morning, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. Michelle made breakfast, and we sat there like nothing had changed, but everything had. We kept it going for a few weeks, sneaking around like teenagers. She'd joke about how scandalous it all was, and I'd laugh, but deep down, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like we were playing with fire. Part of me knew that this couldn't last, that it was bound to end badly, but another part of me didn't care. I like how she made me feel seen and valued in a way that I hadn't in a long time. Then one weekend, Sarah came back to town unexpectedly. Michelle called me in a panic, telling me that I shouldn't come over, that we needed to keep things under wraps. I told her I understood, but I couldn't shake this sick feeling that everything was about to unravel. Sure enough, a couple of days later, I ran into Sarah at the local coffee shop. We exchanged the usual small talk, but she kept giving me these weird looks like she could sense that something was off. Later that night, I got a text from Michelle. "We need to talk." I went over to her place, bracing myself for the worst. She looked upset, more than I'd ever seen her, and she told me that Sarah had found out. She'd seen my car parked outside one night when she came over to surprise her mom, and she'd put two and two together. They had a huge blow-up, and Sarah accused her of trying to replace her dad, of being selfish, of using me. Michelle said she didn't know how to respond, and honestly, neither did I. "I think we need to end this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't lose my daughter over this." I nodded, even though it felt like my chest was being crushed. We hugged awkwardly, and I left, knowing that there was no going back. After that, things went back to being strained and awkward. Sarah never confronted me directly, but whenever we ran into each other, she wouldn't even look me in the eye. Michelle and I didn't talk anymore, and I missed her more than I thought I would. I'd see her sometimes when I drove past her house, and I'd wonder if she regretted how it all ended as much as I did. It's been about a year since then. I moved to a new city, got a new job, tried to leave all of that behind me. But sometimes I think about those nights with Michelle, and I wonder if I was just a bandage for her loneliness, and if she was the same for me. I'll never know for sure, but I do know that I wasn't the only one who got hurt. I haven't spoken to Sarah since, and I doubt I ever will. Part of me wants to reach out to her, to explain my side of things, but I don't think she'd want to hear it. Maybe she's right. Maybe there's nothing to explain. Sometimes, you just have to accept that you've made a mess of things and move on, even if the past keeps whispering in your ear. I haven't told anyone about this, not even my closest friends. They think I'm a pretty easygoing guy, a jokester who doesn't let things get to him. But what I'm carrying, it's like a shadow that follows me everywhere, and sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be able to shake it off. It started when my dad passed away about 6 years ago. He was the rock of our family, and when he died, it was like everything just crumbled. I told everyone I was handling it okay, that I was working through it in my own way. But in reality, I was unraveling. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, just replaying all these memories in my head, thinking about all the things I never got to say to him. My wife tried to help. She really did, but I couldn't open up to her. I just kept pushing her away, until one night she got fed up and left to stay at her sister's for a while. And that's when it happened, when I made the mistake that I've been hiding ever since. I'd had a few too many drinks, which was becoming a regular thing by then. It was one of those nights where I just couldn't handle the silence. So I logged onto this website where people sell, well, let's just say they sell attention. It was just supposed to be a distraction, a way to numb myself for a bit. But before I knew it, I'd spent over $500 on cam girls. I didn't even think about it at the time. My mind was so foggy. I just kept clicking and paying, feeling like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. When I woke up the next morning and saw my bank account, it hit me like a ton of bricks. What had I done? It wasn't just the money, though that was bad enough. It was the realization that I'd crossed a line I never thought I would. I felt sick, ashamed of myself, and I deleted all my accounts and told myself I'd never go back. But the damage was already done, and the guilt felt like it was eating me alive. My wife came back a few days later. She wanted to work things out, and I tried my best to pull myself together for her. But I couldn't bring myself to tell her about what I'd done. How could I? She'd been going through her own grief, and here I was, hiding this secret that would shatter whatever fragile piece we'd managed to find. So I buried it, pushed it down as deep as I could, and promised myself that I'd never let it happen again. For a while, things got better. We went to therapy, tried to reconnect, and I managed to cut back on the drinking. But the secret? It never really went away. Every time she talked about money, or we made plans for the future, I'd feel this knot in my stomach, this awful sense that I was living a lie. Sometimes, I'd catch her looking at me with this expression, like she knew something was off but couldn't quite put her finger on it. And that only made me feel worse. A few months ago, she mentioned wanting to start a family. That's when the panic really set in. I realized that I couldn't keep living like this, hiding this massive mistake that she had no idea about. But every time I try to imagine telling her, the words just get stuck in my throat. How do you explain something like that? A few years ago, my girlfriend Sarah and I rented a cabin by a lake for a quiet weekend away from the city. It was a small, rustic place, tucked at the end of a winding dirt road surrounded by thick pine trees. We loved the idea of disconnecting. No cell service, no internet, just us, a few books, and the sound of the lake lapping against the shore. It was early autumn, the air cool and crisp, with the leaves just starting to turn. Perfect. The first night was uneventful. We sat by the fire pit, roasted marshmallows, and watched the moonlight dance on the water. The lake stretched out like a black mirror, reflecting the stars. It felt like we were the only people in the world. But on the second night, things changed. It was around 11 p.m. when we heard the first noise, a sharp crack from the woods behind the cabin. Sarah looked at me, her brow furrowed. "Probably a deer," I said, trying to sound casual. But truthfully, it put me on edge. We stayed inside, playing cards at the dining table with the sliding glass door open to let in the cool air. But I kept glancing out at the darkness beyond the deck, feeling an inexplicable tension settle in my chest. Then came another sound, this one closer, a heavy rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. Sarah went to the door, peering out into the night. "Do you see anything?" I asked, joining her, but she just shook her head. I couldn't see anything either, but the darkness felt unnaturally thick, like it was hiding something just beyond our view. We shut the door and tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the unease. I felt like we weren't alone anymore. Then, just as we were about to head to bed, there was a loud knock on the front door. It was a slow, deliberate knock, 3 taps, spaced out. Not the kind of knock you'd expect from someone who might need help. My stomach dropped, and Sarah stiffened beside me. "Who the hell would be out here at this hour?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. The nearest town was nearly an hour's drive away, and we hadn't seen another car or person since we'd arrived. I walked over to the front door, hesitating before I peered through the peephole. The porch light was on, casting a dim glow, but I couldn't see anyone. Just the empty porch and the edge of the woods beyond. I waited, listening, but the only sound was the wind in the trees. I whispered back to Sarah, "There's no one there," but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. We stood there for a few seconds, both of us on edge, when we heard it again, the knock, this time from the back door, the one leading to the deck by the lake. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "This isn't right. We need to leave." My mouth was dry, and every part of me agreed, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. "Maybe it's just some kids messing around. Who drives out to the middle of nowhere in the dead of night to play pranks?" she snapped. I knew she was right. There was something wrong about this whole situation. We crept to the sliding glass door, peeking through the curtains. At first, we didn't see anything, just the black water of the lake shimmering in the moonlight. But then a shadow shifted at the edge of the deck, and my heart skipped a beat. A figure stood just beyond the light, half hidden in the shadows, facing the door. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching. My hands started to shake. I took a deep breath and called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Hey, what do you want?" My voice echoed across the lake, but there was no response. The figure just kept standing there, unnaturally still. That's when I realized they were holding something, a long, thin object that glinted in the light from the porch. "We're leaving," Sarah whispered urgently, pulling me toward the bedroom. "Pack up now." I didn't argue. We grabbed our bags, shoving clothes and toiletries in without caring about neatness. I kept glancing back at the sliding door, expecting to see the figure closer, but they just stayed in that same eerie spot. When we finally crept out the front door, I noticed that our car's interior light was on, like someone had opened the door. My blood went cold. "Did you leave it like that?" I asked Sarah, but she shook her head, looking just as scared as I felt. I scanned the area around the car, but the shadows between the trees felt like they were crawling, shifting. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to walk slowly, trying to stay calm. We got in the car, and I locked the doors as soon as we were inside. I turned the key, praying the engine would start without a hitch. It sputtered for a second, then roared to life. As we backed out, I caught a glimpse of the figure moving toward us, their face hidden in the shadows of a hoodie. I stomped on the gas, gravel spitting under the tires as we tore down the dirt road. My heart was pounding, and Sarah clutched my arm so tightly I thought she might break the skin. We didn't stop until we reached the first gas station on the highway, miles away. We parked under the bright lights and sat there, catching our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Did you see what they were holding?" I shook my head, my hand still gripping the steering wheel. I couldn't tell, but I think it was a knife. We called the police, but by the time they reached the cabin, there was no one there. They found our back door wide open, the lock broken. Whoever it was, they hadn't taken anything, just left the place ransacked, clothes strewn around, the mattress flipped. The officers tried to reassure us, saying it was probably just a drifter or someone looking for a place to squat. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. We never went back to collect the rest of our things. The cabin's owner mailed our remaining clothes and refunded us the rest of the rental fee with an apology, saying they'd change the locks and upgrade the security. But it didn't matter to us. We didn't want anything to do with that place ever again. To this day, I still get chills whenever I hear a knock at the door late at night. I'll never forget the way that Shadow moved on the deck, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. And I'll never stop wondering what might have happened if we'd stayed inside and ignored our instincts to run. I never thought a dumb prank would get me and my best friend almost arrested, but that's high school for you. 1 minute, you're just having a laugh, and the next, you're running from the county sheriff. It all started one cold night in late October of my junior year. My best friend, Jake, and I decided we'd try to go coyote hunting. Neither of us had any real experience, but Jake had an old rifle from his dad, and I had this romantic idea of us being rugged hunters or something. But, to be honest, we had no idea what we were doing. We wandered through this huge cornfield behind Jake's farmhouse, hoping to hear a coyote's howl or catch a glimpse of glowing eyes in the distance. The reality, though, was just a lot of stumbling around in the dark and complaining about how cold it was. I think we scared off any wildlife with our constant tripping over fallen branches and whispering about how stupid this plan was. After a few hours of seeing absolutely nothing and not even firing a single shot, we finally gave up. But instead of going straight home, we decided to sit down and rest on the edge of the field, looking up at the stars, just talking about whatever came to mind. That's when Jake, ever the idea guy, suddenly suggested we pull a prank on our girlfriends. His plan? We'd each text them, saying that the other one had gone crazy and tried to shoot us during a coyote hunt. Jake texted my girlfriend, saying something like, "I don't know what to do." He snapped. He just pointed the rifle at me. I had to shoot him in self-defense. I sent a similar message to his girlfriend, claiming that Jake had gone off the rails, and I'd had to defend myself. We thought it'd be funny, something to make us look like a couple of wild badasses, like we'd been in some dramatic Western showdown. Of course, we didn't think for a second about the fact that Jake's girlfriend's dad was the county sheriff. Yeah, that was a detail that might have been important to remember before we hit send on those texts. We waited for a few minutes, expecting a few confused or panicked replies, but instead, both of our phones started blowing up with calls from unknown numbers. When we didn't pick up, the calls turned into messages, angry, panicked messages from our girlfriends, and eventually from the sheriff himself. "Where are you boys? What the hell is going on? Answer your damn phones." He left one voicemail after another, each one sounding more furious than the last. That's when the panic set in. Jake's face went pale, and he kept checking his phone, muttering, "Dude, what do we do? What do we do?" I tried to keep my cool, but I was freaking out too. It wasn't just that we'd gone too far with the prank. We'd gone way too far. But, being the idiots we were, instead of coming clean immediately, we decided to drive back to Jake's place and figure out how to fix things before anyone actually showed up. We jumped into Jake's rusty pickup truck and tore down the dirt road back to his farmhouse, trying to come up with a plan. But before we could even get halfway there, we saw flashing red and blue lights in the distance, bouncing off the trees and lighting up the road like a twisted carnival. The sheriff's SUV came flying down the road toward us, gravel spraying out from under his tires. We skidded to a stop, and I could feel my heart beating so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. Jake threw the truck in a park, and we both stumbled out, our hands up like we were in some bad TV cop show. The sheriff, his face red and eyes blazing, jumped out of his vehicle, gun drawn. "Get on the ground now," he barked, and we dropped faster than sacks of flour. I remember Jake mumbling, "We're dead. We're so dead," over and over again as we lay there, faces pressed against the freezing dirt. After what felt like an eternity, he holstered his gun and came over, cuffing us both while he radioed in something about 2 suspects detained. That's when it hit me. He actually thought we'd try to kill each other. This wasn't a prank anymore. It was a full-blown criminal investigation. Jake, finally snapping out of his shock, tried to explain. "It was just a joke, sir. We weren't really. No one's hurt. It was just a prank." He kept babbling, but the sheriff wasn't having it. He just glared down at us, muttering about how we were in more trouble than we could possibly understand. It took another 30 minutes before we finally convinced him to let us up and call our girlfriends to confirm we were both fine. Even then, he kept us handcuffed, standing in the glare of his headlights while he listened to Jake's girlfriend shout at him over the phone about how it was all just some stupid joke. The sheriff rubbed his temples, clearly at the end of his patience. And then he finally turned to us, shaking his head like he couldn't believe he had to deal with such colossal idiots. "I ought to throw you both in jail for wasting my time and scaring the hell out of everyone," he growled. "But instead, I'm letting your parents deal with you. Get in the truck. Now!" That's how we ended up in the back of the sheriff's SUV, driven home like a couple of criminals. He took us straight to Jake's house, where our parents were waiting in their pajamas, looking equal parts furious and relieved. I don't think I've ever seen my dad's face turn that shade of purple before. He grounded me for a month, and I wasn't allowed to see my girlfriend for even longer. But the real punishment was dealing with the aftermath at school. By Monday, everyone had heard about what we'd done. Word spread fast, with plenty of exaggeration thrown in. Some kids claimed we'd been caught in a full-on shootout, while others swore we'd planned some elaborate crime spree. Our girlfriends refused to talk to us for weeks, and Jake's girlfriend dumped him, saying she couldn't date someone who didn't have the common sense God gave a goose. Honestly, I couldn't blame her. Even our friends thought we were idiots. Every time we tried to hang out, someone would crack a joke like, "Hey, don't pull a gun on me, all right?" Or, "You guys planning any more midnight ambushes?" Jake and I took it all with grim smiles, but deep down, I think we both knew we'd earned the ribbing. The only silver lining was that the sheriff never officially charged us. I think he just wanted to scare us straight, but he warned us that if he ever caught us pulling a stunt like that again, he wouldn't hesitate to throw the book at us. That stuck with us, and after that, we kept our pranks limited to harmless stuff like toilet papering houses or messing with the morning announcements. Years later, when we catch up over drinks, Jake always brings up that night. "Man, we were so stupid," he'll say, shaking his head. Like, what the hell were we thinking? And we'll laugh about it now, because enough time has passed that we can see how lucky we were that things didn't end up worse. But there's still that shiver that runs down my spine when I think about lying on that cold ground with a gun pointed at me, all because of a joke that went way too far. It's funny how those memories stick with you. The ones where you come right up to the edge, and you only realize how close you came to disaster once you're looking back at it from a safe distance. And yeah, it's become one of those stories we tell at reunions, always good for a few laughs. But if there's one thing I learned that night, it's that high school is plenty wild on its own. You don't need to add gunshot pranks into the mix. This is going to sound absurd, but my secret is that I've become a modern-day vigilante. Not like Batman or anything, but I've been secretly picking up my neighbor's garbage at night. It all started during lockdown, when the world went quiet, and I started noticing everything a little too much. The mess in my neighborhood, it just ate at me. Overflowing trash cans, wrappers blowing down the street like tumbleweeds, and those nasty plastic bags caught in the trees, flapping in the wind like taunts. So one night when I couldn't sleep, I grabbed a pair of gloves and a trash bag, and I just went for it. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a weird impulse, a way to burn off that restless energy. But after that first night, I started looking out my window every evening, noticing the same piles of litter accumulating in the same spots. So I went out again and again. Before I knew it, I had a routine. Once the streetlights came on and the neighborhood dogs quieted down, I'd pull on my hoodie, slip on some gloves, and head out with a trash bag. At first, I was scared someone would see me, think I was up to no good, like who skulks around at night in a hoodie, picking up garbage. But the streets were always empty, and I got a little braver. I started venturing into the alleyways behind the grocery store, cleaning up the heaps of discarded beer bottles and takeout containers that seemed to reproduce overnight. I'd listened to true crime podcasts while I worked, which was maybe not the smartest choice for someone creeping around in the dark, but it kept me entertained. And honestly, it was kind of peaceful in a twisted way, like my own little secret mission. After a few months, I noticed that the neighborhood Facebook group started talking about the mysterious cleanup fairy. People were posting pictures of the freshly swept sidewalks and tidier alleyways, and everyone had theories. Some thought it was the city, some thought it was a neighbor who didn't want recognition. There was even this one lady, Mrs. Parks, who swore up and down that it was the spirit of some long-dead janitor who used to work at the local school. I couldn't help but laugh at that one. Here I am, a 30-something with a normal day job, and Mrs. Parks thinks I'm some kind of ghost. But I kept my mouth shut. It was easier that way. And honestly, it felt kind of good to have this little secret. It's like, I might not be saving lives, but at least I'm doing something positive, even if nobody knows it's me. And let's be real, with the way things have been going in the world, it's nice to feel like you have some control over something, even if that something is just a pile of soda cans. But then one night, things got a little complicated. I was in the middle of hauling a heavy bag of trash into one of those community dumpsters when I heard a voice behind me. "Hey you, what do you think you're doing?" My heart leapt into my throat, and I nearly dropped the bag. I turned around expecting to see a cop or maybe a cranky neighbor with a flashlight, but it was just this guy from down the block. Jimmy, I think his name is. He's in his 60s, always wearing those old-school jogging suits, even though I've never actually seen him jog. I froze, trying to think of some excuse, but my mind went blank. Just, taking out the trash, I blurted, which technically wasn't a lie. He squinted at me, clearly not buying it. But then, instead of calling me out or threatening to report me, he just shook his head and muttered, "Weird kid," before shuffling off back down the alley. After that, I realized I needed to be more careful. I started wearing a cap pulled low over my face, and I made sure to stick to the shadows. It was like being in a low-stakes spy movie, but I loved it. I even splurged on one of those grabber sticks, the kind they sell to senior citizens, so I wouldn't have to touch anything gross. I was in deep, and a part of me wondered if I should just tell my neighbors, maybe try to organize a community cleanup instead. But then I thought about the way they'd look at me. Either like I was some self-righteous do-gooder, or just plain nuts for spending my nights this way. I didn't want the attention, or the weird looks. I just wanted to keep doing my thing, in secret. And for a while it worked, but then about a month ago, I found a new kind of trash in one of the alleys. A bunch of used needles, tucked behind the old laundromat. It freaked me out. I'd never seen anything like that before. I stared at them for a long time, just trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, I went home, put on thicker gloves, and came back with a container to dispose of them safely. The whole time I kept thinking this is way above my pay grade. But I couldn't just leave them there, you know? Kids walk down that alley sometimes. So, I took care of it, and then I went home and sat in the shower for a good half hour, scrubbing my hands even though I'd been wearing gloves. Now, every time I head out for my patrol, I'm a little more on edge. It's one thing to pick up candy wrappers and soda bottles, but I'm no hero. I'm not equipped to deal with anything serious, and I keep waiting for the night when I come across something I can't handle. But I keep going out there anyway. Maybe because I've come this far and can't turn back now, or maybe because deep down, I like the idea that I'm doing something no one else would bother with. And here's the wildest part. My girlfriend doesn't know. She thinks I have insomnia, which is technically true, and she just assumes I go out for late-night walks to clear my head. If she knew I was spending hours every week picking up trash in sketchy alleys, she'd probably have me committed. I can picture her face if I ever told her. This mix of confusion and that "are you kidding me?" look she gets when I do something stupid, like the time I tried to fix the sink myself and ended up flooding the kitchen. So, yeah, that's my secret. I'm a nighttime trash collector, a self-appointed cleanup fairy, or whatever they're calling me online. I keep telling myself I'll stop someday, that I'll let the city handle it, but then I see another crushed beer can or a bag of old clothes dumped in the park, and I'm back out there with my grabber stick. It's strange how a little secret can take over your life like this. How something that started as a joke can turn into a mission. And honestly, I don't know what that says about me. Maybe I'm just a little crazy. Or maybe, in a world that feels like it's falling apart, this is my weird, tiny way of trying to hold things together. This all happened when I was 22, a few years out of high school, and trying to piece my life together after dropping out of community college. I had moved back to my hometown and ended up working at this bar where a lot of locals hung out. It was the kind of place where the same faces showed up every night, and among those regulars was Mr. Thompson, my old buddy Mark's dad. Mr. Thompson had always been one of those cool dads, the type who'd crack open a beer with us after a long day of yard work and let us sneak sips at family cookouts. After his wife left him, he started coming to the bar more often, and we'd chat between pouring drinks. He was always talking about how lonely he was, how he missed having someone to share his life with now that Mark was living across the country. One night, I was closing up the bar, and Mr. Thompson, no, Tom by then, was the last one there. We got to talking about the usual stuff, relationships, life, how things never seem to go the way you plan. He did a few too many, and as I was locking up, he asked if I wanted to keep him company a little longer. Said he had some decent whiskey back at his place. I should have known better. I mean, what kind of 20-something goes back to their friend's dad's house for a nightcap? But I was feeling kind of down myself, like maybe both of us just needed someone to hang out with, so I said sure. We ended up back at his place, sitting in his living room, listening to classic rock on his ancient stereo. And yeah, the whiskey was good, maybe a little too good. We started talking about relationships, his failed marriage, my last girlfriend who ghosted me when she moved to LA. Tom looked at me, and there was this strange intensity in his eyes, like he was trying to see through all the bravado I'd put up since I'd come back to town. He leaned in, and before I knew it, he kissed me. And not in some awkward, tentative way. It was like he'd been holding back and decided to throw everything he had into it. For a second, I froze. This was Mark's dad, for crying out loud. But then, against every logical part of my brain, I kissed him back. We ended up in his bedroom. I'd like to blame the whiskey, but honestly, there was a part of me that wanted it, a part of me that was just as lonely as he was. It was all so surreal, like stepping into some strange alternate universe where none of the usual rules applied. When it was over, we just lay there, both of us too stunned to say anything. I remember looking at the ceiling, thinking, what the hell did I just do? The next morning, I woke up in a panic, half-dressed, with the sun streaming through his bedroom window. I grabbed my clothes, mumbled some excuse about needing to get to work, and bolted out the door. I was sure that was the end of it, that we'd both just agree to pretend it never happened. But later that day, I got a text from him. You okay? We didn't talk about it directly, but a few days later, he showed up at the bar again, like nothing had changed. And honestly, for a while, nothing did. We fell into this strange pattern of meeting up after my shifts, sometimes at his place, sometimes in the back of the bar after hours. We never talked about Mark, or about what we were doing, really. It was like we were both in on this secret that no one else could know. But I couldn't keep my head straight around him. There were times when he'd look at me, and I'd see this sadness in his eyes, like he knew this wasn't sustainable. I mean, he was in his early 50s, and I was barely into my 20s. Eventually, it all came to a head when Mark came back home for Thanksgiving. He wanted to catch up, so we met up at the bar, and the whole time I felt like I had a neon sign over my head that said guilty. Tom showed up that night too, and I could see the panic flash across his face when he saw me sitting with Mark. He played it cool, but I could feel the tension between us like a live wire. After a few awkward beers, I made up some excuse about needing to get home, but before I left, Tom caught me outside. He told me that it was probably best if we stopped seeing each other like we had been. He said he needed to focus on his relationship with his son, and I agreed, even though I could feel my chest tightening at the thought of it being over. We didn't talk for a few weeks, and Mark went back to the city. But the thing is, Tom and I had gotten used to each other. We started up again after Mark left, but this time it was different. We both knew it couldn't last, that it was a temporary fix for something deeper. When he called things off for good a few months later, I wasn't even surprised. He said he'd met someone his own age and wanted to try to make it work. I nodded and told him I understood, even though it felt like I was swallowing broken glass. I'd like to say that I moved on quickly, but it's hard when you've been keeping such a big secret, especially from someone you've known your whole life. I never told Mark, and Tom never did either, as far as I know. I still see him around town sometimes with his new girlfriend, and we exchange polite nods like nothing ever happened. But every time I run into Mark, there's this little pang of guilt in my gut. I'm not proud of what I did, and I know Tom isn't either. It's just one of those things you do when you're lonely and lost and looking for connection in all the wrong places. I guess I've learned to live with it, but there's always this lingering feeling like there's a part of my life that I can't ever really share with anyone. So, yeah, if there's a moral to this story, it's that life gets messy and people do stupid things when they're hurting. But if I had to do it over again, I'd like to think I'd make better choices. I'd like to think I'd have the guts to tell Tom how I really felt, instead of just going along with it because it was easier than being alone. I always thought I'd be the last person to get cheated on. I was the guy who paid attention to every detail, who would surprise her with her favorite snacks and remember anniversaries she'd forgotten. So when I started noticing small things, her being extra distant, a new interest in poetry of all things, I just brushed it off as her needing space. She never used to read much, but suddenly, every other evening, she'd have her nose buried in some book of love poems. I thought, hey, good for her, right? But the more time she spent with those books, the less she seemed to want to spend with me. And when I asked about it, she'd give me this vague smile and say, "It's just something I'm exploring." Then came the accusations. One random Thursday, she cornered me in the living room and accused me of flirting with the cashier at the grocery store. I laughed it off, thinking it was some weird joke, but she was dead serious. She'd never been the jealous type, so this caught me off guard. I mean, it's the grocery store. Do people even flirt over broccoli? But she wasn't laughing. She actually started crying, saying how she couldn't believe I'd disrespect her like that. It didn't make any sense, but she got so upset that I started to feel guilty. I thought maybe I'd been too friendly or something, even though I knew deep down that I hadn't done anything wrong. But after that, the accusations became a weekly thing. She'd nitpick every interaction I had with any woman, from my co-workers to the barista at our favorite coffee shop. I started feeling like I was under a microscope. It didn't matter if I was just saying hello to someone. She'd give me these long, suspicious looks. She even went through my phone once, which was rich considering I'd never so much as glanced at hers. But then she'd turn around and accuse me of not caring about our relationship enough to check in on her. It was exhausting. I started wondering what had changed, but I never quite put the pieces together. One night, I'd had enough and just asked her straight up, "Why are you so worried about me cheating? Is there something you're not telling me?" She froze, then started crying like hysterical sobbing. I thought I had crossed some invisible line, but it turns out I had just hit the nail on the head and unnerved her. She couldn't look me in the eye for days after that. She'd start shaking whenever her phone buzzed, like it was a live grenade. And suddenly, she became super protective about where she left it. Always face down, always within arm's reach. One Saturday, she went out for coffee with a friend she never mentioned before. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but my gut wouldn't let it go. So, like an idiot, I drove by the cafe she said they'd be at. I know it's not my proudest moment, but when I got there, I didn't see her car or any sign of her inside. I felt like a stalker, but the doubts were eating me alive. I drove around a bit, and just as I was about to head home, I saw her car parked outside a small bookstore about a mile away. She was sitting in the front seat, talking to some guy I'd never seen before. They weren't holding hands or anything, but the way she was leaning in, smiling at him, it wasn't how you smile at a friend. I didn't confront her right away. I couldn't. I just went home and tried to act normal when she got back. But that night, I barely slept. I kept replaying that scene in my head, wondering if maybe I had just misread it, if maybe there was a reasonable explanation. I wanted so badly to believe her. But then, 2 days later, I found her old phone in a drawer while looking for a charging cable. It was password protected, but I tried a few of her usual codes and one of them worked. What I found made my stomach turn. Text between her and that guy, going back for months. They had met up every weekend, sometimes during the week when I thought she was at work. And the worst part? She never even mentioned me, not once. It was like I didn't exist in that part of her life. I waited until everything was calm and normal, if it's even possible at that point, and I sat her down and asked her how long she had been cheating on me. She tried to deny it one time, and I just told her to stop lying and try the truth. She broke down immediately, sobbing uncontrollably, and finally admitted it. She kept saying, "I didn't mean to hurt you. I was confused. I didn't know how to stop." I just stayed calm and told her that we couldn't be together anymore, but there was no point in either of us getting angry and fighting. It was like all my anger had drained out of me. I just felt tired. That was pretty much it. We broke up, and she moved out within a week. The hardest part was how my friends reacted. Some of them said they always had a weird feeling about her, but didn't want to say anything. I kept thinking, why didn't you? And of course, there were the ones who told me I should have known, that the signs were obvious. It made me feel stupid, like I'd been walking around with blinders on. But it's not that simple when you're in it. You want to trust the person you love. You want to believe that if something was wrong, they'd talk to you instead of sneaking around behind your back. Now, looking back, I can see all the little signs. The extra attention she put into her appearance. The way she'd go cold whenever I try to talk about our future. And especially the way she'd twist everything around to make me feel like I was the problem. It's been over a year, and I've moved on, but that trust one used to have in people? Yeah, that's gone. I'm working on it, but it's hard. Every time I start dating someone new, I find myself watching for those same signs. afraid of missing them again. If I've learned anything from this whole mess, it's that sometimes the signs are there, but we just don't want to see them. We convince ourselves that it's all in our heads because the alternative is too painful to face. But I'd rather face it head-on now than live in doubt. So, to anyone out there who thinks they're imagining things, trust your gut. It's rarely wrong. You ever hear about the unseen death lurking in your own home? I'm talking about carbon monoxide, silent, odorless, no warning. You know, the kind of danger that feels like it should only exist in a true crime documentary or some tragic news story, but never in real life. That's what we thought too, until it almost took my cousin Jess. She had just moved into this cheap basement apartment in a crumbling old building on the edge of her college campus. I remember her showing us photos when she first moved in, talking about how the rent was a steal, even though the place looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 80s. But to her, it was a little slice of independence. "It's cozy," she'd say, flashing that optimistic grin she always had. Sure, there was a weird smell in the hallway, and the windows barely opened, but it had charm. And when you're 20 and on a student budget, charm is all you can afford. She didn't think much of the space heater her landlord had given her for the winter. It looked like something out of a garage sale, with scuffed metal edges and a faint rattle when it was turned on. Jess joked about it, calling it Old Smoky, and laughing about how it kept the place warmer than it had any right to. We'd all laugh along, never imagining that little heater could turn into a death trap. But after a few weeks, Jess started feeling off. It was little things at first. Headaches, this constant grogginess she couldn't shake. She thought it was just the stress of midterms, or maybe a lack of sleep from pulling all-nighters. "I swear, it feels like I'm hungover all the time, even when I haven't touched a drink," she told me over the phone one night with that laugh she used when she didn't want to admit something was wrong. I remember teasing her, telling her to lay off the cheap campus food and get some real sleep. She promised she'd take a break soon, but she never did. If I'd known what was really happening, maybe I would have pushed her harder. The night everything went wrong, her roommate, Carla, was out at some party across town. Just decided to stay in, trying to catch up on sleep after weeks of running on fumes. She cranked up Old Smoky because it was freezing outside, made herself some ramen, and curled up on the couch with a blanket. She never even made it halfway through the movie she was watching before she passed out, slipping into a sleep that she might never have woken up from. Carla came back a few hours later, tipsy and happy, still humming some song from the party. She found Jess sprawled out on the couch, face pale and lips a strange shade of blue. At first, she thought Jess had just fallen asleep with the heater blasting and the windows shut, so she tried to shake her awake, calling her name. But Jess didn't move. Panic started to creep in, and Carla noticed how cold Jess's hands were. The way her breathing was shallow and irregular, barely more than a faint wheeze. Carla told us later that she almost froze, unsure of what to do, just staring at her best friend like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Somehow, Carla managed to dial 911, and when the paramedics arrived, they took one look at the space heater and started shouting orders. They dragged Jess outside into the frigid air, slapping an oxygen mask over her face, and Carla just stood there in her party dress, shivering from the cold and shock, while they worked to bring her back. It turned out that the space heater had a faulty vent, leaking carbon monoxide into the room. Jess had been breathing it in for hours, slipping deeper and deeper into unconsciousness without even realizing it. The paramedics told Carla that if she'd come back even half an hour later, Jess might not have made it. They loaded her into the ambulance, and Carla rode with her, holding her limp hand the whole way to the hospital, whispering, "Don't you dare leave me, Jess." She spent 3 days in the hospital, hooked up to oxygen tanks, with her mom, and Carla camped out in the waiting room, living off vending machine coffee and stale sandwiches. The doctor said she was lucky, so lucky, in fact, that the attending nurse joked they should have bought a lottery ticket on her behalf. But Jess didn't laugh. She just lay there, staring at the ceiling, as the reality of how close she'd come to dying finally sank in. When Jess got out of the hospital, she moved out of that basement apartment immediately. Carla helped her pack up her stuff, and they left Old Smoky behind, rusting in the corner like some twisted relic of a near tragedy. Jess didn't talk much during the move, her usual chatter replaced by this heavy silence, like she was afraid that speaking would make everything real. She bought a carbon monoxide detector that same day and put it in every room of her new place. Just in case, she told me when I visited her later, her smile strained and hollow. I could see the dark circles under her eyes. She wasn't sleeping much, too scared to drift off and not wake up. I did some research after that, and it blew my mind how many people die from carbon monoxide poisoning every year. It's called the silent killer for a reason. Most people don't even know they're in danger until it's too late. The gas just seeps in, invisible and scentless, taking over your lungs until you slip into unconsciousness, never realizing that your last breath is just around the corner. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, it's just gone. Now every time I see those little CO detectors in hardware stores, I think about Jess, about how close she came to being just another tragic statistic, another face in a yearbook that people talk about in hushed tones. I remember visiting her new apartment for the first time, watching her obsessively check the batteries on each detector, her hand shaking slightly. It's strange, seeing someone you've always known as so carefree, suddenly so fragile. But that's what a close call with death does to you, I guess. It makes you realize how thin the line is between ordinary life and catastrophe. Jess is better now, but she'll never forget that night. Neither will Carla, who still can't walk past that old building without feeling a knot in her stomach. Sometimes, when we're all together, Jess will crack a joke about how she's CO-resistant now, but there's a nervous edge to it. We laugh along, but it's a different kind of laugh. One that remembers how quickly everything can change, how close we came to losing her. It's wild how something you can't even see can kill you like that. You think your home is your safe place, but sometimes it's the invisible dangers that get you. Most of us never think about carbon monoxide detectors until it's too late, until you realize that the cost of one could be the difference between life and death. Jess's story became a cautionary tale among our friends, a reminder that sometimes the scariest dangers are the ones you never even think about. Now I always keep a carbon monoxide detector in my own place too. Even bought one for my parents and made them promise to use it. I'm not taking any chances, because that silent, unseen death, it's out there lurking, and it doesn't care how young or old you are or how safe you think you feel. Jess taught me that the hard way, and I'll never forget it. It's a lesson that could save your life, even if it's the kind you hope you never need to learn. So, this all went down when I was 19. I was living at home, saving up for a place of my own, and working at a hardware store to make ends meet. There was this one woman, Claire, who came in pretty regularly. She must have been in her early 40s, but she had that kind of energy that makes you forget age. Tall, fit, always put together, and her smile. Yeah, that smile could make you forget how to count change. She was always friendly with me, asking about my day, making jokes about my name tag, that sort of thing. I didn't think much of it because, I was just the kid behind the register, and she was this polished older woman. One day, she came in right as my shift was ending and asked if I wanted to grab a drink with her. I thought she meant at some nearby coffee place, but she laughed and said, "No, I mean a real drink." I was a little stunned, but said yes, figuring, why not? We ended up at this little bar that no one my age went to. More of a place for folks who wanted to drink in peace. It felt a bit weird walking in with her, but I quickly realized that no one cared, or at least pretended not to. We started talking, and I mean really talking. She told me about her divorce, how she'd been raising her daughter pretty much on her own, and how she'd been feeling like life was slipping away. I told her about feeling stuck in my small town, about how I wasn't sure what the next move was for me. She laughed and said, "Well, you've got plenty of time." Me, I'm just trying to squeeze some excitement out before I'm officially old. I couldn't help myself. I said, "You're far from old, Claire." She smiled in a way that made me feel like I'd passed some kind of test. Before I knew it, we were closing down the bar. She offered to drive me home, and on the way, she took a detour to this lookout point over the town. It was cheesy as hell, but when we got there, she leaned over and kissed me. And I kissed her back. It's not like I didn't know what was happening, but I convinced myself it was just a flirty little moment. But when she invited me back to her place, I didn't say no. Her house was just a few streets away from mine, this cozy little place with tons of character, just like her. One thing led to another, and yeah, we ended up in bed. It was the first time I'd ever been with someone older, and it was, well, intense. It felt different from the usual clumsy hookups I'd had. It was like she knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it, and I was just along for the ride. Afterwards, we were lying there, and I was feeling all sorts of things, mostly confusion and maybe a little excitement. I think she sensed it because she turned to me and said, "This doesn't have to be a big deal, you know? Let's just keep this fun." And that's what we did. For the next few months, we'd meet up when she didn't have her daughter, always keeping things casual, always at her place or in her car late at night. I'd show up after my shifts and we'd sit in her living room, have a drink, watch a movie, and then, well, you get the idea. It was like living in this little bubble where nothing outside of it mattered. But things got complicated. One night, after we'd done our usual routine, she started talking about how she'd been feeling more than she expected. She hinted that maybe she was catching feelings, and I froze up. I wasn't looking for anything serious, and I told her that as gently as I could. She tried to laugh it off, but I could tell it hurt. We kept things going, but it wasn't the same after that. She'd make little comments like, "I bet you're going to find some nice young girls soon," and I'd try to change the subject. It all came crashing down one night when I ran into her daughter, Emily, at a party. I had no idea Emily even knew I existed outside of the hardware store, but she came up to me, drunk and giggling, and said, "So, are you like my mom's boy toy or something?" I nearly choked on my beer. It was one of those moments where your whole world comes to a screeching halt. I tried to play dumb, but she just laughed and said, "Yeah, she's not that great at keeping secrets, you know." I left the party early and went straight to Claire's place. I told her what Emily had said, and she looked like she'd seen a ghost. She kept saying she wasn't supposed to know, she wasn't supposed to know. I didn't know what else to say, so I just said maybe it was time to end things, and she agreed, but not before a few tears were shed on both sides. It was the first time I realized that, despite everything, I actually cared about her. I went home that night feeling like the world's biggest idiot. Emily never brought it up again, but she gave me these looks whenever we bumped into each other in town, like she knew exactly what kind of mess I'd made. Claire and I stopped talking altogether. I'd see her sometimes at the grocery store or driving by, and she'd give me a small, sad smile. A few months later, I heard from a mutual friend that Claire was dating some guy closer to her own age, and honestly, I was relieved. I wanted her to be happy, even if it wasn't with me. But there's still this part of me that wonders what would have happened if I hadn't freaked out, if I'd let myself feel more. Maybe it would have ended badly anyway. Or maybe, I don't know. I haven't told anyone else about this until now. It's just one of those weird chapters in life that you keep to yourself, like some crumpled up page you're too embarrassed to read again. But if I could go back and do it over, I'd tell myself to be more honest with her, and with myself. This is something I've never told anyone, not my family, not my closest friends, not even my therapist. They all think I'm just a regular guy with a regular life. But the truth? I live in my own house of cards, and I keep expecting it to collapse around me. It all started with a small lie, the kind you tell without thinking it'll get out of hand. But oh, did it get out of hand? About 5 years ago, I lost my job. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a round of layoffs that wiped out half the department. At first, I was okay with it. I thought I'd take a couple of months, apply to new places, maybe even try something different. But weeks turned into months, and the rejections kept piling up. I'd never been without a job for that long, and it started eating away at me, gnawing at my confidence until I couldn't even look at job postings without feeling sick to my stomach. So, I did what any rational adult does when faced with a crisis. I pretended it wasn't happening. I kept up the charade, left the house at the same time every morning, wore my work clothes, and drove around aimlessly for hours. I'd sit in parks, libraries, sometimes even fast food joints just to kill time. Then, at the end of the day, I'd go home like I'd had a full day at work. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't bring myself to admit the truth to anyone, not even my wife. You'd think she would have noticed, but honestly, we were both in our own worlds back then. She was finishing her degree and working long shifts, so we barely crossed paths during the day. At first, I told myself I was protecting her from stress. She had enough to worry about without knowing her husband was unraveling. But deep down, I knew it was more about my own pride. I couldn't stand the thought of being seen as a failure. After a while, the severance money ran out, and I started dipping into our savings to cover the bills. I thought I'd only use a little just to keep us afloat until I found something. But weeks turned into months, and I kept digging deeper into the account until one day, it was just empty. I'll never forget the way my hands shook when I realized I'd drained everything. The guilt hit me like a wave, but instead of coming clean, I made the worst decision of my life. I applied for a credit card in her name. I told myself it was just a temporary fix, that I'd pay it back as soon as I found a new job. But the longer I went on, the deeper the hole got. I paid off one card with another, juggling balances like a circus act. At some point, I even started forging job offers to show her, just in case she asked about my work. But she never really did. She was so focused on her own life that she didn't notice the cracks forming underneath. Then one day, she came home and told me she was pregnant. That moment should have been pure joy, and in some ways it was. But I remember standing there frozen because all I could think was, I can't keep this up much longer. I knew I couldn't hide my secret forever, not with a baby on the way, but I also couldn't imagine what would happen if I came clean. The fear of losing everything paralyzed me. I scrambled harder than ever to find work after that. I took up odd jobs, freelance gigs, working under the table, anything that paid, but nothing stuck. The economy wasn't in my favor, and neither was my own anxiety, which by then had grown into a constant, suffocating presence. The pressure was unbelievable. I'd sit awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to my wife breathing beside me, wondering how much longer I could keep up the lie. Now, our son is almost 2 years old, and somehow I'm still balancing everything. We have more credit cards than I can count, all maxed out. Every day is a tightrope walk, trying to keep us afloat without tipping over into disaster. There are days when I think about just vanishing, packing up my car, driving until I run out of gas, and starting over somewhere new. But I can't do that to them. Somehow, I've managed to keep my wife from noticing. At least I think I have. Sometimes she'll ask about when I'm getting that raise I've been promised, or she'll suggest looking for houses to buy, and my chest tightens like a vice. I'll make up some excuse, say we should wait a few more months, and she'll nod, trusting me like she always has. That's the part that kills me the most. Knowing how much she believes in me when I don't even believe in myself. I've thought about telling her the truth 1,000 times, rehearsing the conversation in my head until I'm sick of my own voice. But every time, I choke on the words. I don't know if she'd leave me or try to work through it, but I can't bear to see the look of disappointment on her face. So, I keep pretending, hoping that maybe miraculously I'll find a way out of this mess before it all comes crashing down. Some days, I almost convince myself that I can pull it off, that I'll land a real job that pays well enough to fix everything before she ever finds out. But then I look at the mountain of debt, at the stacks of envelopes with past due printed in red, and I know I'm living on borrowed time. It's like standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the ground give way beneath your feet inch by inch, but being too afraid to jump. The worst part is, I'm not even sure who I am anymore. Am I the guy who's trying to provide for his family, or the coward who's too scared to admit his mistakes? I don't know. All I know is that I can't keep living like this, but I don't know how to stop. So, I wake up every morning, put on my work clothes, and keep pretending, praying that tomorrow will be the day everything changes. But deep down, I know that if I don't find a way out soon, I'll end up losing everything that matters most. It was supposed to be a simple drive back home, just a few states over. My college roommate, Kate, and I had planned it out. Hit the road at dawn, drive through the day, and split a cheap motel for the night to rest before finishing the last leg of the trip. We'd done this before and figured we had it all mapped out. But you know how sometimes plans just fall apart without warning? Yeah, this was one of those times. We got a late start and then hit terrible traffic. By the time we made it through the last stretch of winding mountain roads, it was pitch black and pouring rain. The kind of rain that turns the world into a smear of gray and makes it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. We were both exhausted and stressed when we finally saw a neon sign flickering through the downpour. Vacancy, Mountain View Motel. The sign was half burnt out, but we didn't care. It was cheap, and we just wanted to crash. The motel was exactly what you'd expect. Peeling wallpaper, stained carpets, and a bored-looking guy at the front desk who barely glanced up from his TV. He handed us a single key, an actual key, not a card, attached to a massive wooden fob. Room 7. The place was almost empty, but we were too tired to care. The room was musty and damp, but we dropped our bags and collapsed onto the beds. Kate fell asleep almost immediately, but I couldn't shake a nagging sense of unease. I brushed it off as being overtired, maybe even a bit paranoid from watching too many horror movies. But then I heard it, a faint scraping sound like metal against metal coming from outside the window. I froze, straining to hear through the sound of the rain hammering on the roof. It could have been a tree branch, I told myself, or maybe just a loose piece of the motel's rusted awning. But then it came again, slower this time, deliberate. I sat up, peering through the thin curtains, but all I could see was the empty parking lot, slick with rain. That's when I noticed the light by the front desk, usually visible through the office window, was out. Total darkness. Something in my gut twisted, a wave of dread that settled deep in my bones. I glanced over at Kate, still sound asleep, oblivious to the growing tension in the air. I tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe the guy at the desk just turned off the light and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Suddenly, the scraping noise shifted, this time right outside our door, followed by a soft, almost rhythmic tapping. My heart leapt into my throat. It was like someone was testing the door handle, trying to be quiet but not quiet enough. I got up slowly, pressing my ear to the thin wood of the door. For a moment, there was nothing, just the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Then, barely more than a whisper, I heard a voice. "You girls alone in there?" Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I shook Kate awake, slapping a hand over her mouth to stop her from crying out. Her eyes went wide when she saw my face, but she didn't make a sound. I pointed to the door and mouthed, "Someone's out there." She nodded, her expression shifting from confusion to fear. We crept to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. Through the rain, we could make out a shadowy figure, hunched low near our door, fiddling with the lock. I caught a glint of metal in his hand, a crowbar or something like it. "We need to leave," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. Kate grabbed her keys from the nightstand, and we both started packing our bags in a panic, trying to keep quiet. But before we could even zip them shut, the doorknob rattled violently. The man outside began banging on the door, harder and harder, like he knew we were trying to escape. "Come on, let's just talk," he shouted, but there was something wrong with his voice. Too eager, too unhinged. My hands shook as I shoved my phone into my pocket, but there was no signal out here. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but we were on the second floor with no easy exit. Then I remembered the fire escape at the end of the hall. I grabbed Kate's arm, and we bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind us. We sprinted down the hallway, our footsteps echoing on the old linoleum. Behind us, I heard the door to our room splinter as the man forced his way in. I chanced to look back and caught a glimpse of him. Tall, soaking wet, with a twisted smile that made my blood run cold. We burst through the door leading to the fire escape, nearly slipping on the rain-slicked steps as we clambered down. As we reached the ground, we heard the sound of heavy boots hitting the metal stairs behind us. "Go, go, go!" Kate screamed, and we ran for the car, barely managing to unlock it with shaking hands. As soon as we threw ourselves inside, I fumbled with the keys, my hands slippery with rain and sweat. The engine roared to life just as the man reached the bottom of the stairs. He lunged toward the car, but I slammed my foot on the gas, and we shot out of the parking lot, tires skidding on the wet asphalt. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the rain, watching us with a look of pure rage. We didn't stop driving until we reached the next town, pulling into a well-lit gas station where we could finally catch our breath. We told the cashier to call the police and waited in the car, still drenched and trembling. When the local cops finally showed up, they drove back to the motel to check it out. They found the room we had rented completely trashed, doors splintered, bed overturned, but no sign of the man. The officer told us we were lucky to have gotten out when we did. Apparently, the motel had a reputation for attracting drifters and worse. They never caught the guy, and we never found out what he wanted. But I'll never forget the way he smiled when he saw us running. The kind of smile that made it clear he enjoyed the chase. To this day, I double-check every lock and avoid motels like the plague. Some part of me wonders what might have happened if I hadn't woken up to that sound, or if we'd ignored the feeling and stayed put. But I'll never let myself find out. There's no way I'll ever forget the time our school's homecoming dance got crashed by a literal biker gang. This was in my junior year, back when everything still seemed larger than life. Our school had a tradition of throwing these over-the-top homecoming dances in the gym, and that year's theme was Midnight Masquerade. It was cheesy as hell. Imagine a high school gym done up with dollar store masks, twinkling lights, and streamers hanging from the basketball hoops. But, of course, we thought it was the peak of sophistication. The night started out pretty normal. The DJ was blasting whatever was popular back then, probably something by the Black Eyed Peas, and everyone was either dancing awkwardly in clumps or taking selfies near the photo booth. I remember I was hanging out with my buddies near the refreshment table, trying to down my third cup of sherbet punch before the chaperones could figure out that someone had spiked it. All in all, it was your typical small-town high school dance, where the most scandalous thing happening was the freshmen trying to sneak off into the shadows behind the bleachers. But then, right around 9 p.m., just when people were starting to get into it, the gym doors swung open and enrolled a group of 5 bikers. And when I say rolled in, I mean it literally. They rode their motorcycles into the gym, engines rumbling like they were in the middle of some action movie. These guys looked like they'd stepped right out of a Sons of Anarchy episode. Leather jackets, long beards, and tattoos snaking up their arms. And they had these smug, defiant grins like they knew they'd just crashed the lamest party in the world. For a solid 10 seconds, nobody knew what to do. Everyone just froze, staring at these bikers like they were aliens. Even the DJ cut the music, and the only sound in the whole gym was the deep, throaty rumble of those motorcycles. The air smelled like gasoline, and I remember watching a chaperone, the gym teacher, Mr. Dobbins, drop his styrofoam cup, splattering orange punch all over his khakis. Then one of the bikers, the leader I guess, swung his leg over his bike and hopped off. He scanned the crowd like he was searching for someone, and you could practically hear a collective gasp when he pointed across the gym. "I'm here to talk to Lisa," he announced in this gravelly voice that echoed off the bleachers. And sure enough, standing at the edge of the crowd was Lisa Rodriguez, one of the chaperones, looking like she'd seen a ghost. Lisa used to be a cheerleader back when she went to our school, and everyone knew she had a bit of a wild side back in the day. But now, she was married, and her kid was a freshman, one of those shy kids who always kept his head down. And here she was, watching as her ex from some ancient, rebellious past showed up at homecoming night, like he was coming to reclaim the life he'd left behind. It took a few seconds for the whispers to ripple through the gym. "That's her old boyfriend," someone hissed. "He got kicked out of school years ago," another kid added. Suddenly, this homecoming dance wasn't just lame anymore. It was the most interesting thing that had happened in our town all year. Lisa's face went from pale to beet red, and she marched right up to him, trying to keep her cool. "You need to leave, Jesse," she said, her voice barely keeping steady. But Jesse just grinned, like he knew he had the upper hand. "Not until we talk," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. And then, right in front of the whole school, he pulled out this massive bouquet of wilted flowers from his saddlebag. It was surreal, like some twisted version of a rom-com scene, only with the entire student body as the audience. Lisa grabbed the bouquet, snapped something at him under her breath, and the two of them started arguing right there on the gym floor. Meanwhile, the other bikers just stood around like they were waiting for a bar fight to break out. A couple of the seniors, probably feeling braver than they should have, sidled up to them and tried to chat, but the bikers just ignored them, arms crossed and faces stoic. It felt like the entire gym was holding its breath, waiting to see if things were about to explode. That's when Mr. Dobbins finally snapped into action. He puffed out his chest and walked up to Jesse like he was about to single-handedly end the confrontation. "This is a school function," he announced, trying to sound authoritative, "and you're trespassing. You need to leave immediately." Jesse just smirked, but then he actually turned to his crew and gave them a little nod. "All right, boys, let's roll out." And just like that, they mounted their bikes again, the engines roaring to life. But before they left, Jesse turned back one last time, locking eyes with Lisa. "I'll see you around, Lisa," he said, And then they revved out of the gym, leaving tire marks on the polished floor and a cloud of exhaust that hung in the air like the memory of a bad dream. After they left, there was this stunned silence in the gym. No one knew whether to laugh or keep quiet. Then one of the freshmen let out a shaky giggle, and the whole place erupted in a chatter. Everyone was asking each other if they caught the whole thing on video, and the DJ tried to start the music up again, but the vibe was completely gone. Lisa stormed out of the gym, red-faced and flustered, and a few of the teachers hurried after her, but the damage was done. We thought the drama was over, but of course, in small towns, things have a way of getting even messier. By Monday, everyone had their own version of the story. Some said that Lisa's husband showed up at the biker bar that weekend and got into a fistfight with Jesse. Others claimed that the flowers Jesse had given her were some kind of secret message, like they'd planned the whole thing together. The rumor mill was on overdrive, and every kid in school had an opinion on what the real story was. But the wildest part came when the school decided to ban all future homecoming dances for safety reasons. They sent out this serious letter to all the parents, saying that the incident had been a disruption to the educational environment, which just made everyone laugh. They acted like the bikers had been planning a hostile takeover of the school instead of a failed romantic gesture. The next week, someone found tire marks on the football field, spelling out a giant Lisa in block letters, like Jesse had come back in the middle of the night for one last word. The principal tried to keep it quiet, but of course, the whole school found out, and everyone joked that Lisa had a secret admirer who couldn't take a hint. I even heard that someone made a TikTok about it that went semi-viral. And Lisa? She didn't come back as a chaperone after that. She still worked at the school as an office assistant, but she kept to herself. Her son transferred schools a few months later, and we never saw him again. The whole thing became one of those high school legends that gets bigger every time it's told. Everyone added their own spin on what really went down that night. Some people said Lisa had been in on it from the start, while others insisted that Jesse was a stalker who'd been planning his return for years. But no matter how many times the story got retold, no one could forget that surreal moment when those bikers roared into the gym like a scene straight out of a movie. For years after, every time I drive past the school, I still half expect to see Jesse hanging out in the parking lot, waiting to make another dramatic entrance. It's one of those memories that sticks with you, not just because of the craziness, but because it felt like a glimpse into this secret, grown-up world that we'd only ever heard whispers about. It was messy and weird, and in the end, we were just kids trying to make sense of it all. But that night, for a little while, it felt like anything could happen, and maybe that's why I'll never forget it. I've been secretly living a double life as a guru of sorts, and the kicker is I don't believe a word of it myself. It all started as a joke, really. A few years ago, I was in this online forum where everyone talked about meditation, chakras, and manifesting their dreams into reality. And I don't know why, but I thought it'd be hilarious to make an account and pretend to be some sort of spiritual guide. I made up this persona named Sunfire Sage, the kind of name that feels like it's ripped straight from a self-help book you find at a dusty bookstore. At first, I just posted silly advice like, align your spirit with the morning sun to invite prosperity, or light a candle with intention, and the universe will hear your whisper. The sort of vague, feel-good stuff that people seem to eat up. I thought I'd get a few laughs, maybe some eye rolls, and that would be it. But then something unexpected happened. People started to believe me. Not just believe me, trust me. They started demanding me with their life stories, asking for guidance, sharing their struggles. And while I kept playing along, before I knew it, I had amassed a small following. I even got invited to be a guest on a podcast about spirituality and mindfulness. I thought about turning it down, but then I figured, why not? It's not like I had anything to lose. So I called in with my best wise voice, spouted off some platitudes about finding inner peace through stillness and the energy of the full moon. And people ate it up. The host called me a modern-day philosopher, and I nearly choked on my coffee trying not to laugh. Now, fast forward a year, and I've got this entire online community built around my alter ego. They share Sunfire Sage quotes on their Instagram stories. They tag me in photos of their crystal collections, and some of them even send me handmade gifts, bracelets, incense holders, and once a crocheted scarf in chakra colors. It's surreal. And the thing is, as ridiculous as it all is, I've started feeling responsible for them. Like, somehow, I'm helping these people find meaning or comfort in their lives, even if I'm just making it all up as I go. It's not all fun and games, though. Sometimes it's downright terrifying. I've had people message me saying things like, "Your words helped me through my darkest days," or "I was about to give up, but your teachings showed me a new path." And I think to myself, what teachings? I made all this up while binge-watching Netflix and eating pizza. They think I'm some enlightened being, when really, I'm just a guy in sweatpants who forgot to take out the trash last night. The guilt is a constant nagging thing. I've thought about coming clean so many times, but then I imagine the fallout. How betrayed they'd feel, how angry they'd be. There's this one woman, Clara, who messages me every few weeks to update me on her spiritual journey and thank me for my divine wisdom. She told me she quit her job to focus on her art after a particularly passionate post I made about following your soul's calling. And every time I read her messages, I feel like I'm holding a knife behind my back, ready to plunge it into her trust. I've even had to get better at this whole spirituality shtick. I actually started reading up on meditation techniques and Eastern philosophies, just so I could sprinkle some real knowledge into my posts. And you know what's wild? It's actually kind of relaxing. I never expected that. I tried a guided meditation once just to see what all the fuss was about, and for a few minutes, I felt a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. Maybe there's a little truth to this stuff after all, but I'm definitely not the expert they think I am. Of course, I've had some close calls. A few months ago, I was doing an Instagram live as Sunfire Sage, and my cat, Mr. Whiskers, jumped onto my lap, knocking over my camera. I panicked, scrambling to get everything back in place before anyone noticed the stack of dirty laundry in the corner of my room. I played it off as the universe reminding us to embrace chaos, but my heart was racing the whole time. That's the thing about living a lie. You're always one misstep away from the whole house of cards collapsing. I've even got a dedicated group of followers who want to organize a retreat. They want to fly me out to some cabin in the woods where I'll lead them in soul-cleansing exercises. I'm this close to finding a way out of it. Maybe say I'm on a spiritual sabbatical, or that I need to commune with nature alone for a season. But a part of me wonders if I could actually pull it off. I picture myself standing in front of a bunch of strangers, leading them in breathing exercises while trying not to crack up at the absurdity of it all. The thing is, I know this can't last forever. Someday, someone's going to figure it out. They'll notice that Sunfire Sage is just a regular dude with a 9-to-5 job who spends more time thinking about what to order for dinner than about the mysteries of the universe. And when that day comes, I'll have to face the fallout, deal with the anger, the disappointment, and probably lose whatever little online legacy I've built. But until then, I'm stuck in this weird space between reality and fiction, where I'm somehow both a fraud and a source of comfort for people who need it. So, that's my secret. I'm not a spiritual guide. I'm not even sure if I believe in half the stuff I post about. I'm just a guy who got caught up in a joke that went way too far, and now I'm trying to keep the charade going without completely destroying the lives of the people who put their trust in me. It's exhausting, and sometimes I wish I could just delete the account, vanish into the digital ether, and forget the whole thing ever happened. But then I get another message from Clara, where someone shares a post saying how much Sunfire Sage has changed their life, and I just keep going. Because maybe, just maybe, a part of me likes being needed, even if it's all built on a lie. I grew up in the countryside, where electric fences are just part of the landscape, like barns and rusty tractors. To city kids, they probably sound like something out of a sci-fi movie, but for us, they were just part of everyday life. Most people don't think much about them. They're there to keep livestock in, right? But if you've ever been shocked by one, you know that they pack a punch, more than enough to make a grown man flinch. As a kid, though, they're basically like, warning, free dare challenge. It's stupid, but when you're young and bored, what else are you gonna do? My friends and I used to test who could hold on to one the longest. Classic dumb kid stuff. We'd gather around, daring each other to grab the wire for a few seconds, and then laugh like maniacs when someone got zapped and yelped. It was a rite of passage. The fence would give you a quick, sharp jolt, enough to make your arm tingle for a while, but not enough to really hurt you. Or so we thought. We never imagined that something we played around with could actually kill. There was this one time, though, my buddy Joe decided he was going to outdo us all. It was late summer, and we were hanging out behind his family's property, the air thick with the smell of hay and that faint, earthy scent of cow manure. You know, classic farm life. We were bored out of our minds, so we started up the electric fence game again. Joe, always the show-off, took it a step further. He announced that he was going to jump over the fence entirely. "Watch this," he said with a cocky grin, as if he was about to do something Olympic-worthy. We all thought it was hilarious at first, egging him on. "Yeah, Joe, go for it. Show us how it's done." He climbed up on this old wooden crate, right next to the fence, tried to psych himself up. He swung one leg over, balancing precariously like some awkward gymnast. And that's when it happened. He slipped. I'll never forget the sound he made when he landed, chest first, right on top of the electric wire. It was this strangled, inhuman scream that cut through the summer air like nothing I'd ever heard before. We all froze, our laughter dying in our throats. For a second, I thought he was kidding, playing some kind of twisted joke. But his body started jerking violently, like he was being yanked around by invisible strings. His face twisted up in pain, and his eyes were wide open, staring at us like he was seeing something terrible. We all panicked. None of us knew what to do. None of our dumb games had ever gone this far. I remember my hands shaking as I tried to yank him off the wire, but the moment I touched him, I got a jolt too and fell back, my arm going numb. The fence buzzed with this sinister hum, like it was alive and angry. It felt like time had slowed down, every second stretching out forever while Joe's screams echoed in my ears. Finally, my friend Sarah, who was usually the most timid of the group, grabbed a nearby branch and used it to shove Joe off the fence. He collapsed on the ground, twitching, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't breathing. I'll never forget the way his chest heaved as he gasped for air, his face pale and sweaty like he'd just run a marathon in the middle of a heat wave. He just laid there, eyes wide open, barely blinking like he was in shock. We all stood around him, staring down at his limp form, our minds reeling. I don't think any of us knew how close we'd come to watching our friend die right there in front of us. It turned out that the fence had been more powerful than usual that day. Joe's dad had adjusted the voltage to keep some stubborn cows from breaking through. He had no idea we'd be messing around with it, of course. When he found out what happened, he was furious, yelling at us for being so reckless. But under the anger, I could see the fear in his eyes, the way his voice shook when he told us how lucky we were that Joe didn't have a heart condition or something. "You idiots could have killed him," he shouted, and I'll never forget the way his voice cracked when he said it. Joe spent the rest of the summer walking around like a ghost, his usual swagger completely gone. He wouldn't even go near the fence again. Anytime we tried to joke about it, he'd just go quiet, staring off into the distance like he was replaying those terrifying seconds in his head. I think he realized how close he'd come to dying, and it messed him up more than he wanted to admit. He even started wearing this cheap cross necklace his grandma gave him, which we all thought was weirdly out of character. But after that day, nothing about Joe was quite the same. As for the rest of us, we never played the electric fence game again. The whole thing became this unspoken memory, like a ghost hovering between us whenever we hung out. It's funny how something that seemed like harmless fun can shift into a nightmare so fast. It changed the way we saw everything: electric fences, the farm, even each other. I guess when you're a kid, you think you're invincible, but moments like that remind you just how fragile you really are. Years later, I still can't drive past those old farms without thinking about Joe and that summer. It's become one of those memories that stick with you, even when you try to forget it. I've read about how electricity can mess with your heart if it hits just right, and I realize how lucky Joe was. He could have gone into cardiac arrest right there, with us standing around like clueless kids, not knowing what to do. We all thought of the electric fence as this background noise in our lives, a mild annoyance at worst. But that day taught us a lesson that none of us will forget: how something you think is a joke can become deadly in the blink of an eye. To this day, if I ever find myself near an electric fence, even the flimsy ones, I keep my distance. It's not worth the risk. And every time I hear that faint, crackling hum, I remember Joe's face as he fell, the way his body jerked like a puppet. It's a sound that gets under your skin, reminding you that some things just aren't worth testing. That electric fence wasn't the only thing buzzing that summer. Our innocence, our sense of invincibility, that all got fried too. Lesson learned, electricity and dares don't mix, unless you're looking for an express ticket out. And trust me, there's nothing cool about being the kid who nearly got fried like a bug on a zapper. Even years later, the memory hits like a jolt, reminding me that the things we take for granted can be the deadliest of all. My boyfriend, Matt, and I were on a road trip through the Pacific Northwest, making our way down the scenic coastal highway. We loved taking detours, exploring little roadside attractions, and stopping in tiny towns that most people wouldn't bother with. It was early October, and the leaves were turning gold and crimson, making the forested hills feel like something out of a painting. One afternoon, we decided to take a break from driving and find a spot to stretch our legs. We saw a hand-painted sign for a scenic overlook that pointed down a narrow, unmarked road. Matt, always up for a bit of adventure, turned the car down the gravel path without a second thought. It twisted and turned deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser around us, blocking out the sun. After about 10 minutes, I started feeling uneasy. There was no cell service, and the road kept getting narrower. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Matt just grinned at me. "Relax, it's all part of the experience." But as the minutes ticked by, the road grew rougher, and I noticed there were no signs of other cars or recent tire tracks. We hadn't seen another person in miles, and the forest seemed unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath. Finally, the road dead-ended at what looked like an old, abandoned rest stop, a crumbling concrete lot overgrown with weeds, with a rusted picnic table off to one side. "Great spot for lunch, huh?" Matt joked, but even his enthusiasm was fading. There was something oppressive about the air, a heavy silence that made my skin crawl. I couldn't put my finger on it, but every instinct was telling me that we needed to leave. Now, as Matt got out to look around, I stayed in the car, my eyes darting to the tree line. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement. I thought it was a deer at first, but then I noticed the shape was wrong, too tall, and it moved too quickly, vanishing behind a clump of trees. My stomach twisted into a knot. "Matt, get back in the car," I said, trying to sound calm. "Let's go." He looked at me like I was overreacting, but something in my face must have convinced him. He slid back into the driver's seat, and as he turned the key, the engine stuttered and died. I felt a jolt of panic. He tried again, nothing but a click. My heart began to pound in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Okay, this is weird," he muttered, glancing around. Then we both froze as we heard a sound. Footsteps crunching on the gravel behind the car, slow and deliberate. I whipped around, but there was no one in sight. My hands shook as I fumbled with my phone, desperately hoping for a signal, but there was nothing. Then, a voice, soft, barely more than a whisper, drifted through the trees. "You shouldn't be here." It was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it, but Matt heard it too. He grabbed my arm, his face pale. "Okay, let's walk. We'll head back to the main road and call for help." We got out and locked the car, trying to stay calm as we started back up the dirt path. But the farther we walked, the more that sense of dread clawed at my insides. I kept glancing back, sure that we'd see someone, something, following us. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and stretch, playing tricks on my eyes. After about half a mile, we heard it again. Footsteps, this time much closer, accompanied by that same whispering voice. "Why are you here?" It sent a cold shiver down my spine. I squeezed Matt's hand, and we started to run, crashing through the underbrush, no longer caring about the path. Just when it felt like my lungs would give out, we stumbled back onto the main road. I turned, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods behind us, but there was only the rustling of leaves in the wind. My legs were trembling, and Matt was breathing hard, looking as scared as I felt. We kept walking until, miraculously, a car came by, a dusty old pickup with a local driver, who looked puzzled but offered to give us a ride into town. We explained that our car had broken down, but we left out the part about the whispers and the footsteps. When we reached the nearest service station, the mechanic drove us back out to the spot with his tow truck. But when we got there, our car was gone. It wasn't just moved, it was like it had never been there at all. No tire marks, no sign of anything. The mechanic scratched his head, muttering something about the road being tricky and cars getting stuck all the time, but I could tell he was just as unsettled as we were. He drove us back into town, offering to call the local sheriff to file a report. We agreed, but when the sheriff showed up, he looked concerned when we described the spot. That place has been abandoned for decades. Used to be a logging camp, but there were some bad accidents out there. Nobody goes down that road anymore. He promised to keep an eye out for our car, but it was never found. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there, or where those whispers came from. All I know is that every time I think about that voice in the trees, my blood runs cold. I've learned to trust that feeling in my gut, because sometimes it's the only thing standing between you and something you don't want to understand. This all started a few years back when I was fresh out of college, trying to find my footing in the real world. I was crashing at my best friend Joe's place while I figured out my next move. Joe's mom, Denise, was in her early 50s, but honestly, she looked about a decade younger. She was one of those women who had her life together, always impeccably dressed, yoga at dawn, the whole 9 yards. Joe's dad had been out of the picture since high school, so it had just been the two of them for years. And yeah, we all joked about how hot Denise was, but it was all in good fun, until it wasn't. One Friday night, Joe and I were at the local dive bar, but he met up with this girl he was crushing on, so they split off. I hung around a bit, but honestly, third wheeling wasn't my scene, so I ended up walking back to his place. When I got there, Denise was sitting on the porch with a glass of wine, and she offered me a drink. One glass turned into 3, and next thing you know, we're swapping stories about our lives. She told me how lonely she'd been since Joe's dad left, how she missed having someone around who saw her as more than just a mom. I laughed and said, "Hey, I haven't had a date in months. Maybe we're both just rusty." She gave me this sly smile and said, "I don't think I'm that rusty." And then, without missing a beat, she leaned over and kissed me. I remember thinking, what the hell is happening? But I didn't pull away. In fact, I kissed her back. I knew I should have stopped there, but the wine had lowered my inhibitions. And well, things escalated quickly. The next morning, I woke up in the guest bedroom with a pounding headache and Denise beside me, wrapped in the bedsheet. My first thought was, oh God, what have I done? I slipped out quietly, but she woke up and asked me if I was okay. I mumbled something about needing some air and stumbled out to the porch. I was panicking, trying to figure out how to process what had just happened. I mean, this was Joe's mom. How was I supposed to look him in the eye again? Denise came out to the porch a little while later, dressed in one of those fluffy robes, holding a cup of coffee. She sat down next to me, and for a second I thought she was going to tell me it was a mistake. Instead, she just said, "I had a really nice time last night." I looked at her, and I think I managed to squeak out, me too, even though my mind was racing with all the potential consequences. She could tell I was freaking out because she put her hand on mine and said, "Look, we don't have to make this into a big deal. Let's just keep this between us." So, that's what we did. For the next couple of weeks, we would sneak around while Joe was at work or out with his girlfriend. It was intense, and honestly, it was kind of exhilarating, like we were living in some kind of cheesy soap opera. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all going to come crashing down. Every time Joe made a joke about his mom's dating life, I'd just laugh nervously and change the subject. It was like playing with fire, and I knew it. Then came the night it all blew up. Joe had gone out with his girlfriend, so Denise and I had the house to ourselves. We were in the living room, making out like teenagers when suddenly the front door creaked open. Joe came in earlier than expected, and there we were, tangled up on the couch. The look on his face was pure shock, and I'll never forget it. "What the fuck, dude?" Joe yelled, his face turning red. "That's my mom." I tried to explain, but honestly, what could I say? There was no coming back from that. Denise tried to calm him down, but he wasn't having it. He just kept repeating, "How could you do this to me?" I felt like the worst person on earth. He stormed out, and I didn't see him again for weeks. I ended up moving out the next day. Denise apologized to me, but I could see the guilt in her eyes too. We both knew we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I tried reaching out to Joe, leaving voicemails and sending texts, but he never responded. Eventually, I got a job in a different city and decided it was best to put some distance between myself and the whole mess. It's been 3 years since then, and Joe and I still don't talk. I hear he's doing well. He moved in with his girlfriend, and they're expecting their first kid. Denise and I never spoke again after I moved. She sent me a text once, just saying she hoped I was doing okay, but I never replied. I didn't know what to say to her either. Looking back, I realized just how badly I screwed up. It's not like I didn't know better. I knew from the start that it was a terrible idea, but I did it anyway because it felt good in the moment. I wish I could say I've learned from it, that I've grown as a person, but honestly, all it's left me with is a lingering sense of shame. I threw away a friendship over something that, in the end, was just a fleeting thrill. So yeah, if I had any advice to give, it's this: don't sleep with your best friend's mom. It's not worth the drama, the fallout, or the guilt that follows. And if you do, just know that there's no easy way to put that genie back in the bottle. There's a certain cruelty in how obvious it seems in hindsight. You know, we were in what I thought was a solid relationship for 2 years. She was always a homebody, the kind of person who'd rather binge Netflix with a bottle of wine than hit the town. But then, she started getting invites from friends she'd never mentioned before. Dinners, karaoke nights, things she usually hated. I tried to be supportive because I thought she was finally coming out of her shell. Stupid, right? She'd text me little updates like, "Don't wait up, babe. I'll be home late," or "It's just a girl's night." But the texts became less frequent, and the gaps between them got longer. One night, I dropped her off at a friend's place, only to later run into that same friend at the grocery store. I casually asked if they had a good time, and she looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "She said she was out with you tonight," the friend replied. My face must have gone white. The friend's expression quickly turned awkward, and she mumbled something about needing to go. I didn't know what to think. I felt like a fool standing there in the cereal aisle, piecing together what she said with my girlfriend's story from earlier that night. I confronted her about it when she got home. She barely let me finish the sentence before flipping it around on me. "You're always trying to control me," she snapped, tears welling up in her eyes. She made me feel like the bad guy, like I was somehow wrong for being suspicious. It was a textbook deflection, but I didn't realize it at the time. She made me doubt myself, question if I was being too jealous or insecure. I ended up apologizing, even though deep down, I knew something was wrong. She took that apology with a smile and a hug, but she never quite looked me in the eyes that night. As the weeks went on, she kept getting busier. More late nights with friends I'd never heard of, more work events that somehow required a cocktail dress. It was around this time that she became obsessed with her phone. I'd catch her smiling at her screen when she thought I wasn't looking, and she started locking her phone with a passcode. She said it was to keep work stuff private, but I knew that was a lie. She worked in retail, not some secretive tech firm. One night, she left her phone on the couch while she took a shower. I picked it up, hands shaking, and tried to unlock it, but she must have changed the code. When she came back and saw me holding her phone, she freaked out, snatching it from my hand and telling me I had crossed a line. Still, she somehow managed to flip it around again. She accused me of violating her privacy, made it all about how I was insecure and paranoid. For a while, I believed her. I thought maybe I was losing my mind, turning into one of those possessive partners you see in bad TV dramas. But then the dream started. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, convinced that I'd caught her red-handed, only to realize it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But it felt real, you know? Like my subconscious was trying to scream at me to pay attention. The final straw came a few weeks later. I was at a party with some mutual friends, and one of them, who had had a little too much to drink, leaned in and said, "So, how's she doing with that guy? Heard they're pretty tight." I played dumb, pretending I had no idea what he was talking about, but my hands were trembling so badly I had to put down my drink. That night, I went home and waited up for her, sitting in the dark like some kind of movie cliche. She came in, reeking of alcohol and perfume, and didn't even notice I was there until she turned on the light. I asked her directly, "Are you seeing someone else?" She froze, eyes wide, and for a moment, I thought she'd finally come clean. But instead, she burst into tears, sobbing about how I didn't trust her, how I was ruining everything with my accusations. But this time, something in me snapped. I couldn't let her turn the tables on me again. I stayed quiet, just staring at her, and eventually, she realized I wasn't buying it. The tears stopped, and she got this cold, almost blank look on her face. She just said, "I think we should take a break." It was the most surreal thing. One minute she's crying like her world's falling apart, and the next she's as calm as a judge, like she'd been planning to say those words for months. I didn't fight it. I just said, "Yeah, maybe we should." She packed a bag that night and left, and for a week I felt like I was floating like none of it was real. Then a mutual friend called me up, saying she'd seen my ex out at a bar, holding hands with some guy. That was it. I went home, boxed up her things, and left them outside with a note telling her to pick them up when I wasn't around. She never even texted back, just took her stuff and disappeared like 2 years of my life meant nothing. And the weirdest part? I wasn't even mad, just empty, like someone had reached into my chest and taken something that I could never get back. It's funny, people always say that when you find out someone's cheating, you'll be angry, but for me, it was more like relief. Relief that I wasn't crazy after all, that my instincts had been right. But then the emptiness hit, and it stayed for a long time. It's still there sometimes, lurking in the background. Trust issues, I guess. But at least now, I know better than to doubt myself. If something feels off, it probably is. I've been living a double life for almost 7 years now, and I'm honestly not sure if I'll ever come clean about it. See, to most people, I'm just a pretty average guy. I work a 9 to 5 that's tolerable, keep a tidy apartment, and meet up with my friends on weekends to pretend that I have my life together. But the truth? Every weekend, I hop into my car, drive 3 hours out to a tiny town no one's heard of, and I become Jake. Jake is who I wish I could be. He's charming, laid back, and plays guitar at a little bar called the Tipsy Goat every Saturday night. There, I tell people I work on a ranch, that I'm just passing through, keeping things simple. It's a place where nobody asks too many questions because everyone's got their own reasons for being there. To them, I'm not some office drone. I'm the mysterious guy with callous fingers who always has a song ready and buys rounds of cheap beer like money doesn't matter. It started as a way to escape a pretty messy breakup. My ex had told me I was boring, predictable, that I never took risks. That one stung, mostly because she wasn't wrong. For weeks, I sat at home stewing over those words, trying to convince myself she didn't know me as well as she thought. But honestly, deep down, I knew she had nailed it. So one Friday night, I got into my car and just drove. I ended up at some random bar 3 hours from home, feeling sorry for myself with a cheap whiskey in my hand, when I noticed a beat-up guitar behind the counter. I asked the bartender if I could play it, and to my surprise, he shrugged and handed it over. I don't know what I expected, probably to butcher a few chords and make a fool of myself. But instead, it felt like something clicked. People actually clapped when I finished, and this guy named Tom bought me a drink, asking if I played around town. Without thinking, I lied and said I was just passing through, a drifter looking for odd jobs. He nodded like that made sense, like I wasn't completely out of place in that world. The next morning, I woke up hungover in a cheap motel, half laughing at myself for what I'd done. But instead of heading home, I went back the next week. Then the next. After a few months, I was Jake every Saturday, playing at the Tipsy Goat, telling tall tales about life on the road. The people there believed every word. It's funny, the way people fill in the gaps when you don't give them much. I let them believe whatever they wanted to about me. And for once, it felt like I wasn't just another face in a sea of cubicles. Over time, I started to like Jake more than I liked me. I felt free in that town. Like the weight of expectations and all the pressures of my real life melted away as soon as I crossed the city limits. I'd sing songs I'd written years ago, ones I'd never had the guts to share with anyone back home. I'd laugh with strangers until last call, then stumble back to my car, feeling like I'd found a piece of myself that I didn't even know was missing. But keeping up the lie hasn't been easy. My friends have noticed how I'm always busy on weekends, how I've suddenly become cagey about where I'm going. My mom's been asking if I'm dating someone since I started spending so much time out of town. And sometimes I feel like I'm living on borrowed time. Like one day, someone from that little town will run into me in the city and realize I'm not who I say I am. I think about that more than I'd like to admit, but I still can't bring myself to stop. Last month, I almost slipped. One of the regulars, Sarah, who always chats with me between sets, told me she was thinking about visiting the city for a weekend. She asked if I'd show her around. For a second, I froze, imagining how quickly she'd realize that Jake, the easygoing drifter, was actually just a guy who fumbled through spreadsheets all day and couldn't even keep a succulent alive. I told her I wasn't sure if I'd be in town that weekend, that I might be on the road again, and she just smiled and said she figured as much. But that whole conversation left me rattled, and for the first time, I thought maybe it was time to let Jake go. Then Saturday came, and I drove out again anyway. I played my set, shared some laughs, and felt that familiar high of slipping into my other skin. Maybe I'm just too much of a coward to face the truth, that I like being someone else more than I like being me. Or maybe I'm scared that if I give up this part of myself, I'll go back to being that boring, predictable guy my ex couldn't stand. Either way, I haven't figured out how to merge these two lives. So, I keep them separate like oil and water, pretending I'm not constantly juggling lies on both sides. There's a part of me that wishes I could just tell someone to finally admit what I've been doing and see how they'd react. But I know it wouldn't be the same. They wouldn't understand why I need this, why I drive 3 hours each week to be someone I'm not. So, I keep Jake hidden away, only bringing him out when I cross that old highway sign, and I hope nobody catches on before I'm ready to let him go. If I ever am. Until then, it's my secret, my little piece of freedom. Maybe it's not the healthiest way to cope, but for now, it's enough. And if you ask me on a Saturday night, when the bar is buzzing and I'm strumming out a new tune, I'll tell you that Jake doesn't have a care in the world. So, there's this unforgettable day during my junior year when the entire school thought the apocalypse was happening. Our history teacher, Mr. Wyatt, was one of those super intense guys. Imagine a Marine drill sergeant, but with a tweed jacket and horn-rimmed glasses. He could quiet a room full of rowdy teenagers with just a glare, and his lectures always felt more like military briefings. The guy had one big flaw, though. He had a massive, irrational fear of bees. And when I say irrational, I mean if he even heard a buzz within 100 feet, he'd be out the door before you could blink. Anyway, one day, some genius in our class, let's call him Tyler, because of course it was Tyler, decided it'd be hilarious to mess with Mr. Wyatt's phobia. He'd somehow caught a jar of bees over the weekend, and he thought it would be a great prank to bring them into class. He even went as far as to draw a little skull and crossbones on the jar and label it Biology Experiment. His plan was simple. Pop the lid during history class and let a few bees out, just to see Mr. Wyatt squirm a little. Tyler swore it'd be harmless, just a few laughs. But none of us really thought about what would happen next. The fateful day arrives, and we're all crammed into Mr. Wyatt's room, trying to stifle our grins as Tyler pulls out the jar. He waited for the perfect moment, right as Mr. Wyatt was in the middle of a passionate monologue about World War II. Tyler cracked open the lid just a little, and the first bee crawled out, stretching its wings like it was waking up from a nap. It took about 3 seconds for Mr. Wyatt to notice. He stopped mid-sentence, something about the Battle of Normandy, and his eyes locked onto that buzzing little blur. "What is that?" he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger like he'd just spotted a grenade. Tyler tried to hide his grin, mumbling something about a science project, but it was too late. Mr. Wyatt's face went from red to ghost white, and he backed up so fast he knocked over his desk. What happened next is still burned into my brain. Mr. Wyatt scrambled for the door like a guy in a horror movie trying to escape a monster. But instead of just running out of the classroom, he made a beeline, pun intended, for the fire alarm and pulled it with so much force I thought he might rip the thing off the wall. The entire building was immediately thrown into chaos, and the fire alarm echoed through the halls. Students poured out of classrooms, and we were all swept into the flow, looking bewildered while Mr. Wyatt sprinted down the hall screaming, "Everybody out! It's an emergency!" The thing is, Mr. Wyatt pulling the alarm made everyone think there was an actual danger. Word spread like wildfire. Gas leak. Active shooter. Someone said it's a bomb. Within minutes, the whole school had spilled into the parking lot. Kids were hugging their friends, teachers were trying to count heads, and even the school's janitor looked like he was about to pass out from the panic. Tyler, meanwhile, was trying to play it cool, slipping the jar of bees into his backpack like no big deal. But then, just as he thought he was in the clear, one of the bees, probably dizzy and confused, escaped his backpack and started buzzing around the crowd. That's when a freshman girl saw it, let out a shriek, and the panic escalated again. Someone shouted, Is it a swarm? And for a second, it felt like we were extras in some low-budget disaster movie. About 10 minutes later, fire trucks arrived, sirens blaring, with a couple of police cars close behind. And there was Mr. Wyatt standing on the front lawn, trying to explain the situation to the firefighters. He was still so freaked out that he kept pointing back at the school like there was an active threat inside. The firefighters nodded solemnly, clearly imagining some kind of serious gas leak or chemical spill. They suited up, helmets on, gas detectors ready, and stormed the building. Meanwhile, Tyler turned to us and muttered, "Maybe I went a little too far." That was an understatement. While the firefighters swept through the building, trying to find the source of the hazard, the rest of us were huddled in the parking lot, watching the scene unfold. I remember the principal, Mrs. Carter, giving Mr. Wyatt the kind of look that could strip paint off a wall. But she didn't know about the bees yet, and neither did the firefighters. As far as they knew, they were dealing with a serious emergency. They even brought in those yellow hazmat barriers, roping off part of the school like it was a crime scene. But then, finally, one of the firefighters opened the door to Mr. Wyatt's classroom and spotted the jar on his desk. The half-open lid, a few groggy bees still crawling around inside. The guy picked up the jar, looked around the empty classroom like he was being punked, and then carried it out into the parking lot where the entire school was waiting in suspense. The moment he held up the jar for everyone to see, Tyler's face turned the same shade of white as Mr. Wyatt's had been. I heard someone start to laugh. One of those nervous, disbelieving laughs, and then the whole crowd followed, students and teachers alike. Even the firefighters cracked up, shaking their heads like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The police officer who had arrived, all serious and ready to assess the threat, just put his hands on his hips and muttered, "Really? For some bees?" By the time the whole mess was sorted out, the entire school knew about Tyler's little prank. They made him apologize to the entire staff, over the intercom, no less. He gave this awkward speech, stumbling over his words, saying he never meant for it to go that far, and he was just trying to lighten the mood. I could hear kids snickering in their classrooms as his voice echoed through the halls. Tyler ended up with a week-long suspension and had to do community service after school, picking up trash in the parking lot while we all watched him from the cafeteria windows. And as for Mr. Wyatt, he refused to teach in that classroom ever again. He moved his entire history class to the library for the rest of the semester, even though it meant squeezing 30 kids into a room meant for half that number. He claimed it was because he needed more access to reference materials, but everyone knew it was because he couldn't face the sight of that room where he thought the apocalypse had begun. To this day, we all still joke about it at reunions. Tyler swears it was worth it, even if his mom almost killed him when she found out what he'd done. And every time someone mentions a fire drill or a lockdown, someone else will pipe up, "Hey, at least it wasn't the bees again." The best part? Mr. Wyatt eventually left the school a couple years later, but not before they made him pose for a yearbook photo in a beekeeper suit that someone slipped onto him during picture day. He never lived that down. Even now, I can't walk past a fire alarm without remembering that day. The day Tyler's dumb prank turned our whole school upside down, and Mr. Wyatt nearly brought the building down in his panic. It's the kind of story that you look back on with a mix of regret and a huge grin. It's one of those memories that make high school unforgettable for all the wrong and right reasons. It's been nearly 4 years since the incident, and not a single person knows about it, except maybe my dog, but he's a really good listener and terrible at gossip. It happened on a Tuesday night in the dead of winter when I got a text from an unknown number that would change everything. It read, "We have your files. Pay $10,000 in Bitcoin, or we release everything." Now, you might assume this was a scam, and honestly, at first I thought it was too. But then I opened the attachment they sent, and my stomach dropped through the floor. It was an archive of screenshots, videos, everything. My private messages, those less than flattering photos I thought I'd deleted, even some work emails. The cherry on top? A list of all the websites I'd visited. Yeah, even the ones I'd stumbled onto after a few too many drinks. I remember sitting there, my heart racing, staring at that little blinking cursor on my phone screen, wondering how in the hell they'd gotten all that. I don't know if it was some weird hacking scheme or just dumb luck that they picked me. Either way, I didn't have $10,000 lying around. Who does? For the first few hours, I just sat there imagining the fallout if this went public. My boss? Fired. My mom? Disappointed. My friends? Definitely wouldn't let me live down that one enthusiastic message I sent to my ex 2 years back. I felt like I was spinning out, completely helpless, like one of those nightmares where you're running but never getting anywhere. So, I did what any rational person in a crisis would do. I Googled what to do if you're being blackmailed. Spoiler alert, it's mostly just call the police, but that wasn't an option for me. I was way too scared of them finding out about everything, and the thought of explaining it to a cop, just no. The next morning, I thought maybe I could ignore it, that they'd lose interest if I didn't respond. But by the time I got to work, there was a new email waiting in my inbox. Time's ticking. 48 hours left. I could feel my hands shaking as I read it, and it took everything in me not to just scream in the middle of the office. Instead, I plastered on a smile, kept my head down, and tried to act like I wasn't being silently extorted by some faceless stranger. My breaking point came that night. I sat on my couch, wrapped in an old blanket, staring at the clock, thinking about how my life could fall apart in just a day or two. My dog curled up beside me, looking up with those big eyes that said, "Hey, what's wrong, human?" And I just started talking, pouring out everything, telling him how I was freaking out, how scared I was. And of course, he just wagged his tail like everything was fine. In a weird way, that calmed me down. If my dog could still look at me like I was the best person in the world, maybe I wasn't totally doomed, right? So I made a decision. I wasn't going to pay, but I also wasn't going to sit around and wait for my life to implode. I started backing up all my files, changed every password, and deleted every embarrassing photo I could find. If they were going to leak it, I'd deal with the fallout when it happened. And then nothing. A week went by, then 2, and the email stopped. The threats vanished like they were never even there. I never figured out who they were or what they wanted. Maybe they realized I wasn't worth the trouble, or maybe they were just messing with me all along. I'd like to say that experience made me braver, but honestly, it's made me more paranoid than anything. I keep every camera in my apartment covered with tape, and I change my passwords so often I can barely remember them myself. But I never told a soul about it. Not my best friend, not my therapist, nobody. It's like my own personal ghost that I carry around with me. This reminder of how close I came to losing it all. The funny part? I think I learned more about myself from that whole mess than I ever did from any therapy session. I realized how much I care about what other people think of me, how scared I am of being judged or rejected. It's made me more careful, maybe too careful. But every now and then, I look at my dog, and he gives me that look like, "It's okay, you're still my favorite human." And somehow, that's enough. But I can't say I've completely let go of the fear. Sometimes late at night, I still check my spam folder, half expecting another message to pop up, just waiting to drag me back into that panic. And honestly, part of me wonders if I've just been lucky so far, if someday it'll all catch up with me. For now, though, I keep it buried. After all, nobody needs to know how close I came to losing everything over a bunch of stupid photos and emails. I just keep moving forward, one paranoid, password-protected step at a time. I've kept this secret from my entire family for about 5 years now. It's not a small one either. It's a weighty, life-altering kind of secret, the type that wakes you up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat. It's strange how secrets can live inside you, right? They're like roommates who never pay rent, but they occupy every corner of your mind. You see, 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with chronic kidney disease. Yep, the kind that can slowly turn your body into a mess if you don't manage it right. The doctor said it like it was just another piece of information to add to my to-do list. Pick up dry cleaning, pay the electric bill, start preparing for dialysis. The first thing I thought was how I had to keep this from my parents. My dad's already dealing with heart issues, and my mom's been on anxiety meds ever since I can remember. They didn't need another health crisis to worry about, especially mine. I told myself I'd keep it to myself until I got things under control, until I had a better idea of what this meant for my life. But months turned into years, and I got used to lying about where I was going, doctor's appointments, or why I was tired all the time, fatigued from dialysis treatments. There was this one time my mom asked me why I wasn't drinking as much water during family dinners. She thought maybe I was on some new trendy diet. I smiled and said, Yeah, I guess you could call it that. It's easier to lie with a joke, you know? They slide right under the radar that way. I keep imagining the fallout if they found out the truth. I see my mom's face going pale, my dad grabbing my shoulder, his eyes try to hold back tears. I don't want to be the cause of that look on their faces. So I've become an expert at managing my symptoms and my stories. I keep the medications hidden at the back of the bathroom cabinet, behind some old aftershave bottles, as if they could stay invisible there, too. I've even perfected a smile for when my friends drag me out to bars and I have to sip on ginger ale instead of a beer. I've turned my life into a damn stage play, with me as the actor and my kidneys as the understudy that never gets a mention in the credits. The worst part, though, is the isolation. It's a loneliness I can't quite put into words. Because how do you tell your best friend, hey, remember when we planned that cross-country road trip? I'll probably need to map out every dialysis center on the way. How do you explain that your energy levels tank halfway through a hike, or that you've started measuring your life in percentages of kidney function left? So I don't. I just keep my mouth shut, nod along, and hope they don't notice that I'm getting winded faster than before. I've had some close calls. One time, during a family reunion, my cousin brought up that she was thinking about donating a kidney to a coworker. Everyone was so moved by her gesture, and my dad, without missing a beat, says, if any of you ever needed a kidney, I'd be first in line to give one. I almost choked on my soda. I wanted to blurt out, hey Dad, funny you should say that. Care to make good on the offer? But I just laughed and changed the subject to sports. The thing is, I know the clock is ticking. The doctors keep telling me that it's only a matter of time before I'll need a transplant. And I lie to them, too. Pretend I'm more open about my situation than I am. I nod along when they say I should tell my family, agree that support is crucial, then walk out of their office and shove the guilt back into that dark corner of my mind where it's lived for half a decade. I've had to make peace with the fact that I might not be able to keep this secret forever. One of these days, the symptoms will get too hard to hide. One of these days, my mom's going to ask one too many questions, and my dad will notice that I keep dodging invitations to go fishing or play catch with my nephews. And maybe I'll be ready to face that day when it comes. Maybe I won't. But for now, it's just me, my dwindling kidney function, and a lot of guilt. Every morning, I get up and look in the mirror, half expecting to see the truth written on my face like a scarlet letter. But there's nothing there. Just the same tired eyes and forced smile. I keep wondering if I'm doing the right thing, protecting them from this, or if I'm just being a coward, unable to face their concern, their pity. It's a question that I don't think I'll ever have an answer to. So I keep living my double life, part family jokester, part chronic patient. And sometimes, when it's 2 a.m. and I'm too wired to sleep, I think about how much simpler it would be if I just came clean. But then I think about that look on their faces and I clamp down on that thought like a trap. I'll tell them someday, when I'm ready, when they're ready, when the world stops feeling like it'll shatter if I let this secret slip out. Until then, this is just one more thing I'll carry alone. I was with my ex for nearly 7 years, and everything seemed stable, until out of nowhere, he started to become obsessed with his fitness. Now, I know what you're thinking. People pick up new hobbies all the time, right? But this was different. He'd always been more of a TV and snacks kind of guy, but suddenly he was spending 2 hours at the gym every night after work, even on weekends. When I asked if I could join him sometime, he'd laugh it off and say, "It's my me time, babe." And he'd say it with this little smirk, like he was getting away with something. Then the late night started. He'd text me that he had to work late, but the timestamps didn't add up. He would come home exhausted but never had a real explanation for where he had been. One night, I decided to surprise him with his favorite dinner at his office, only to find out he'd left hours earlier. The janitor gave me a confused look and said, "Didn't he tell you he had a night out with friends?" That was the first time I felt my stomach drop. But when I confronted him about it, he brushed it off and made me feel like I was paranoid. "You're being crazy, you know that?" he said, his voice calm like he was stating a fact. I started to wonder if I was just imagining things. But what sealed the deal for me was his phone. He used to leave it on the coffee table, but suddenly it became glued to him. He'd take it to the bathroom, the garage, even out to get the mail. One night, he slipped up and left it charging in the kitchen, and I saw a text pop up from a name I'd never seen before. It was just a heart emoji. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't resist opening the message. It was full of flirty texts, little inside jokes, and her name was saved as Jim Buddy. He'd been meeting her every day after work. I confronted him, and he went pale. Tried to say it was a joke between friends. "You're reading into it too much," he insisted. But his voice cracked, and I saw the sweat on his forehead. It took everything in me to stay calm. He kept talking, but it all just sounded like noise. I left the house that night, stayed at my sister's. He called me over and over, leaving voicemails that ranged from angry accusations to tearful apologies. The worst part wasn't even the affair. It was the realization that I had been gaslit into doubting myself. For months, I had been twisting myself into knots trying to figure out what was wrong, wondering if I was overreacting. It made me feel small, like I was losing my grip on reality. And all the while, he was the one lying through his teeth, weaving this web of deceit while smiling right in my face. 3 months later, I found out he had been seeing someone from his gym. Turns out they had been spotting each other a little too much. A mutual friend spilled the details after a few drinks, letting me know they had been the talk of the gym for weeks. That's when the anger really hit me. I moved out of the apartment the next day, left a note with a key on the counter, and told him to figure out how to pay the rent on his own. And you know what? He never even tried to fight for us. He didn't beg me to stay or ask for a second chance. It was like he had been waiting for me to figure it out, so he wouldn't have to make a decision. I guess in the end, he wasn't as slick as he thought. Looking back now, I can see all the signs that I missed. The way he'd stopped making future plans with me, always keeping things vague, like he was just biding time. The way he'd pick fights over nothing, making me feel like I was doing something wrong just for asking about his day. And the way he'd get defensive whenever I tried to suggest we spend more time together, like I was intruding on his new life. It's embarrassing, honestly, how much I let slide because I trusted him. I wanted to believe that we were just going through a rough patch, that maybe he was stressed or needed space. But I learned my lesson. If someone wants to make you feel crazy for noticing that they're changing, it's because they have something to hide. And if they're suddenly too busy to include you in their life, it's because they're making space for someone else. And to anyone reading this who's wondering if they're being paranoid, trust your instincts. You're not crazy. And if they make you feel like you are, that's probably the biggest red flag of all. You wouldn't think about it until it's too late, but the humble grape can be a death trap. Seriously. It sounds ridiculous, right? Of all the dangerous things out there, who would suspect a grape? My uncle used to joke about it every time we had fruit at family gatherings. He'd hold up a grape, wagging his finger with mock seriousness, and say, "You watch out for these. Sneaky little buggers." We'd all roll our eyes, knowing it was just another one of his dad jokes. But then it almost killed him. I swear, we were all there when it happened, and it was like watching one of those slow-motion disaster scenes in a movie where you can't do anything to stop it. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and we were at my grandparents' place for a family barbecue. You know the kind, kids running around, adults lounging with beers in hand, and everyone pretending they aren't watching their phones under the table. My uncle was lounging on the patio, snacking on a bowl of grapes, keeping half an eye on some football game on TV. He was mid-sentence, complaining about some ref's call, when he threw another grape into his mouth. And that's when it happened. He gasped suddenly, a weird, high-pitched sound, and the next thing we know, he's grabbing at his throat. The grape must have gone down the wrong way, but at first, we thought he was joking, being dramatic as usual. I mean, come on, this is the guy who faked a sprained ankle last year just to get out of playing backyard soccer with us. So we just laughed awkwardly, waiting for him to crack a smile and yell, "Gotcha!" But instead, he turned bright red, his face contorted in panic, clutching his throat like some kind of cartoon character who swallowed a whistle. My aunt, usually the calm one, started freaking out, slapping him on the back, which only made him cough harder, his face turning a deep shade of purple. He tried to stand up, but his knees buckled, and he fell back into the lawn chair, knocking over his beer. That's when the real panic set in. My dad yelled out, "Someone call 911!" And I remember the terror that spread through the crowd. Everyone frozen for a second, realizing, holy crap, a grape is actually about to take him out. My cousin Tim, a 20-year-old college kid who'd never taken anything seriously in his life, suddenly sprang into action. I didn't even know he knew the Heimlich, but apparently, he'd watched some YouTube video about it once. He got behind my uncle and started doing that classic Heimlich maneuver, which, by the way, looks a lot less cool in real life. My uncle's arms flailed around as if he was trying to swat Tim away, but Tim kept at it, his face scrunched up in concentration like he was taking the most stressful exam of his life. After what felt like an eternity, my uncle let out this horrible, gurgling sound, and the grape finally flew out, bouncing across the patio like a little green marble. It landed under the barbecue grill, and for a second, everyone just stared at it like it was some kind of alien. My uncle gasped for breath, collapsing onto the patio table, tears streaming down his face. Not from crying, but from the sheer physical strain of it all. Tim, red-faced and panting, just sort of stepped back and muttered, "Dude, that was way too close." For the rest of the day, my uncle kept rubbing his throat, his voice hoarse, like he was trying to convince himself he could still breathe. He swore off grapes for life after that. I mean, I can't blame him. Anytime someone offered him fruit, he'd wave it away like they were offering him a live grenade. My aunt even threw out every grape in their fridge when they got home. No joke. She couldn't look at them without shuddering. They became the family's running gag for a while, but honestly, you could tell there was some real fear behind the laughs. It's funny, right? People think of choking hazards and they picture little kids with toys, or maybe that guy who eats steaks too fast at dinner. But an adult, taken down by a grape? It's the sort of thing you'd never expect until you see it. And trust me, it's not just about the food. It's about how fast things can change. We were all just sitting there, enjoying the sun, thinking about nothing more dangerous than who'd win the football game. And in an instant, it was chaos. It makes you think about how fragile everything is, how something so ordinary, something you wouldn't give a second thought, can suddenly turn deadly. A week after the whole incident, I looked it up. Turns out, choking is one of the leading causes of accidental death, especially for older adults. It's right up there with falls and car accidents. My uncle, who used to scoff at those statistics, had become a believer, no longer making jokes about sneaky grapes. Every family get-together, since we all seem to hover just a little closer to each other, maybe keeping an eye out just in case. The bowls of snacks don't seem as innocent anymore. My uncle even joked, ironically of course, that he'd have preferred going out with a more heroic story. Death by bear attack or something, he'd say with a laugh. But a grape? That's just insulting. Moral of the story? Even snack time can become a matter of life and death. Don't underestimate the little things that can turn your world upside down in a second. Next time you hear someone joke about killer grapes, just remember, it's all fun and games until one rolls down the wrong way. It was supposed to be just another summer adventure. My friend Jake and I were in our early teens, both outdoor enthusiasts, spending every spare moment exploring the dense woods behind his family's cabin. It was the kind of place where you could lose yourself for hours. Endless trails, hidden creeks, and thick underbrush. We had a favorite spot about 2 miles in, a small clearing near an old, decaying hunter's cabin, where we'd sometimes camp out or just hang by the fire and talk. One afternoon, we decided to hike out there after school. The sun was sinking, casting long shadows between the trees, and the air had that crisp, earthy smell. As we got closer to the clearing, something started to feel off. At first, I thought I was imagining it. You know that sensation where you think you hear footsteps, but when you stop, everything is silent? That was the feeling, but I brushed it off. Jake didn't seem fazed, and I didn't want to be the paranoid one. But as we reached the cabin, I saw it. A fresh set of footprints in the mud, much larger than ours. They led right up to the cabin door, which now hung open slightly. It had always been locked with a rusty padlock, so I knew someone had forced their way in recently. My gut twisted, but Jake shrugged. Probably just some hiker who got curious. I wanted to believe him, but something told me we needed to get out of there. Still, I followed him inside. The air in the cabin was thick and stale, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. Jake was busy poking around, but I couldn't shake the unease. Then I noticed a makeshift bed in the corner, blankets, a half-eaten sandwich, and a dirty backpack. Someone was living here, and they weren't just passing through. I opened my mouth to tell Jake we should leave when a faint sound outside made my blood run cold. It was a low, gravelly hum, like a voice, but too quiet to make out the words. Jake froze too, and I saw the color drain from his face. He motioned for me to be quiet, and we crept to the cabin window, peeking through a crack in the wood. A man stood just outside the tree line, facing away from us, talking to himself. Or at least, that's what it looked like. I don't know what hit me harder, the realization that we were trapped or the sudden understanding that the man wasn't alone. A second figure moved through the trees, his silhouette slipping in and out of the shadows. My pulse pounded in my ears as I grabbed Jake's arm. "We need to go. Now," I whispered, barely daring to breathe. He nodded, but as we backed away from the window, the floor let out a loud creak. The voices outside went silent. My heart dropped into my stomach. I could hear the crunch of footsteps approaching the cabin door, slow and deliberate. Without thinking, I grabbed Jake's hand, yanking him toward the back of the cabin where a small window offered our only way out. We squeezed through the window one at a time, my hands shaking so badly I nearly slipped. As soon as Jake hit the ground, we ran, not caring about the noise anymore. I could hear twigs snapping behind us. Were they following us, or was it just our own footsteps echoing in my head? I didn't turn around to find out. We must have run a full mile before Jake tripped over a tree root, sending us both sprawling into the dirt. I scrambled to pull him up, glancing over my shoulder, but the woods behind us were empty. We lay there, panting, trying to catch our breath. For a moment, everything was quiet, and I thought maybe we were safe. But then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard it, a sharp, high-pitched whistle, followed by low laughter. It was enough to send us sprinting again, all the way back to his cabin. We burst through the door, gasping out what had happened to Jake's dad, who called the local sheriff. They found the abandoned cabin later that night, but the squatters were long gone by the time anyone got there. The sheriff said they'd likely been living in the woods for weeks, maybe longer, scavenging and moving from place to place. I still think about that night sometimes, about what might have happened if we hadn't left when we did. The image of that man standing just outside the cabin, the other figure slipping through the trees, those moments are burned into my memory. We never went back to that part of the woods again, and I've never ignored a gut feeling since. I'll never forget the time we almost got our school shut down over a prank gone disastrously wrong. It was senior year, and like all bored high schoolers desperate to leave a mark, our class decided to go big with our prank. The idea started small. Someone suggested bringing in a few helium balloons to float around the hallways. But then Kevin, the self-appointed prank leader, threw out a wild idea that none of us should have even considered. Why don't we sneak into the science lab and fill the whole room with balloons? Like floor to ceiling. We could make it so you have to swim through them to get to your desk. Of course, we all thought it was hilarious. In our teenage minds, there was no such thing as overdoing it. So, a few of us met up at the local dollar store and bought out their entire stock of helium balloons. Everything from regular round ones to those giant foil ones that look like cartoon characters. We loaded them up in Kevin's dad's van and spent that whole weekend sneaking into the school through a window Kevin swore he could get open because he'd seen the janitor leave it ajar before. Surprisingly, it worked. We were in. Once inside, we wasted no time dragging out the helium tanks from the chemistry storage room. We had one person acting as a lookout, another inflating, and the rest of us shuttling balloons from the tanks to the science lab. It was like some ridiculous heist movie, but instead of stealing anything, we were depositing balloons like bank robbers dropping bags of cash. It took hours, and by 4 a.m., the science lab looked like some twisted version of an amusement park, a sea of colorful inflatables. The real challenge came when Kevin decided we should leave some balloons strategically in the school hallways for maximum impact when teachers came in the next morning. We ended up scattering a few around the entrance and down the main corridor before slipping back out through the window. As we left, Kevin turned back and snapped a quick picture of the lab. Hundreds of balloons stacked up like a massive bubble bath. "This is going to be legendary," he whispered, like he was setting up some cinematic final line. But of course, things went sideways the moment the sun came up. Turns out, our understanding of helium physics was lacking, like seriously lacking. Apparently, when you have hundreds of helium balloons crammed into a closed space, the helium can start to displace the oxygen. It didn't take long for the air quality to plummet, and by 7:30 a.m., the first poor soul who opened the lab door, a substitute teacher, got dizzy and nearly passed out right there. He staggered back into the hallway, gasping for air, while a few of the scattered balloons drifted out behind him. Cue the chaos. The school administrators thought it was a gas leak, and within minutes, the fire alarm blared. We hadn't even made it to first period before we all found ourselves in the parking lot, watching fire trucks and police cars arrive like we were at some impromptu parade. They evacuated the whole building, and all of us pranksters were standing there pretending to be clueless. I remember Kevin standing next to me, eyes wide, trying to look innocent as he whispered, "Dude, we're gonna make the news." It didn't help that someone had called the local news station and tipped them off about a hazardous material situation at the school. By noon, a reporter was there with a cameraman, interviewing frantic parents outside the school gates. And there we were, a bunch of 17-year-olds, trying not to crack up as we overheard one parent asking, "Do you think it's a terrorist attack?" I saw Kevin clench his jaw, trying desperately not to laugh. But as soon as we were out of earshot, we all lost it. Then came the part that none of us saw coming. One of the firemen, decked out in full gear, managed to figure out what was really going on. He pushed open the lab door and was greeted by a tidal wave of balloons spilling out into the hallway. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at the chaos. He turned back to his colleagues with this look of absolute disbelief, and one of them burst out laughing. But then they all snapped into professional mode, ushering everyone back and waving their gas detectors around like this was some serious hazmat situation. They ended up quarantining the entire science wing, and the administration was furious. They even called in some environmental safety guy from the district office to inspect the scene, like we had caused a full-blown disaster. That was when Kevin started to sweat, and I'm pretty sure I saw him whispering a prayer under his breath. For the rest of us, the adrenaline rush was fading fast, replaced by the sinking realization that we were probably about to get expelled, or worse. And then, as if the universe decided we hadn't messed up enough, someone pointed out that one of the helium tanks was missing its valve cap, and the thing was lying on its side. Somehow, in our rush to escape, someone had knocked it over, and it had been leaking all morning. The safety inspector lost it, started ranting about irresponsible kids, and how lucky we were that the whole place didn't go up in flames. All the while, Kevin just stood there, pale as a ghost, probably picturing his parents' reaction to the school bill for hazardous waste disposal. We ended up getting hauled into the principal's office later that day, one by one like a lineup of suspects. Kevin cracked first. He gave this whole speech about how it was supposed to be a symbolic act of joy or something, try to turn it into some deep commentary on school spirit. The principal, Mr. Patterson, just stared at him, deadpan, and said, "You could have killed someone, Kevin." Kevin shut up after that. In the end, we all got suspended for a week, but surprisingly, we didn't get expelled. Apparently, the school board decided that since no one got hurt, it was better to handle it quietly. Kevin's parents were livid, and the rest of us got grounded for what felt like forever. But here's the weird part. No one ever confessed about who tipped over the helium tank. It became this unsolved mystery among our group. Every reunion, we bring it up trying to piece together what happened that night, but no one owns up to it. It's one of those stories that's become legendary, at least to us. The Great Balloon Heist. The day we nearly shut down the school over a dumb prank that spiraled completely out of control. And as much as we got in trouble for it, there's a part of me that still laughs when I think about that firefighter's face when those balloons started pouring out of the lab. It's one of those memories that you look back on and think, how on earth did we survive being that dumb? But we did, and that's why it's unforgettable.